Chapter 1009. The gray fragments of the law dissipated behind Brando like withered petals. He glanced at Haku, who was lying unconscious on the ground, and silently sheathed Halrangaya. At the same time another battle ended. Andrik and Mephistopheles each held a black rapier, and pointed it at the soul fire burning in the hollow chest cavity of the Knights of the Dead Moon. Although Haku was much stronger than either Andrik or Mephistopheles, he was still no match for the two of them together. Besides, there was also Hipamra, who had the power of the mountains and rivers. Brando turned around and walked towards the Knights of the Dead Moon. He knew that Haku would wake up soon. The undead would not really fall into a coma. Haku's current state was just a state of suspended animation due to his soul fire being too weak. This state would not last long. He would either recover quickly or perish completely. He had interacted with this Black Knight of Madara more than once, and knew how difficult it was to deal with her. She had said a lot of things to attract his attention, and he had played along with it. Out of 10 sentences he might not even believe a single sentence. But at least he could confirm that Haku should be a silver elf and was familiar with Metisha. Although Metisha had mentioned that this woman had once used mind reading on her, it could only read the surface of her thoughts. The memories deep in her heart could not be stolen. That was the domain of the gods. As for whether she was the princess of the Silver Elf Empire, it had yet to be verified. After all, this woman was very good at bewitching and swaying people's minds. She would make people fall into anger or confusion before making a move. She especially liked to use spells like mind reading. Her nickname other than the Black Knight. The fair judge was also very clear about this. The impartial judge. Whether she was impartial or not was another matter. But she called herself a judge. She interrogated people about their inner sins, shook people's weak beliefs, and was good at exploiting people's weaknesses. He had to get useful information from the Knights of the Dead Moon as soon as possible. Otherwise, he would not be able to get any information from this woman, unless he was prepared to interrogate them separately. But he did not have the time nor the means to do so. Lorison's undead was still standing in the hall, motionless like a stone statue. Brando came to the Knights of the Dead Moon and quickly found that it was an old acquaintance, the Rotten Knight Krot, one of the 3 Knights of Decay. She and her subordinates, the Skeleton Knight, had invaded Erewhon during the First and Second War of the Black Rose. At the end of the Second War of the Black Rose, Freya. In the middle of the Second War of the Black Roses, he had done a mission, but at that time it was surrounded by armies so he could only see it from afar. Krot was a dark noble of the Sea of the Dead Moon. She used to be a mercenary and was different from Cabius. She was a more combative undead lord, but she was not loyal to the undead lord with the Mercury staff. At best, she could only be regarded as a fence-sitter. He thought about it and was immediately relieved. Which undead lord of Madara was not familiar with him? Thinking of this, he looked back and saw a few skeletons lying on the ground. He knew all of them. Grey Staff Trassa, the commander of the Grey Castle of Lifit. Most of his subordinates were liches, who were good at blood rain. His political stance was a fence-sitter. Bonai Karen, the lord of the Dead Forest. She had an army of pale hunters, who were good at undead cavalry tactics. Trassa was a famous fence-sitter. Barkin a fence-sitter. All of them were fence-sitters. Although the Rotten Knight Krot had died once, she was still very afraid of death. In other words, she was afraid of true eternal sleep. In other words, she was not very tight-lipped. When Brando threatened her, she revealed the truth. Tiamas Choyu or White. Tiamas Choyu was the real name of the Black Knight. This name sounded like an elf's name. In his previous life there were players who guessed that she might have been a wind elf or a wild elf when she was alive, but they never thought that she was a silver elf because the difference in age was too great. Sure enough, she lied. Their purpose here was not to kill Lorison's undead, but for the war slate. However, it was not easy for the undead to enter human territory, let alone pass through several lines of defense without alerting the army. According to Krot, they went out to sea from the Eternal Darkness Harbor and landed at Silver Sand Bay. As soon as they got off the ship, there were humans who arranged their itinerary. They arrived at the wilderness of 4-leaf clover in a carriage. Brando immediately guessed that these people were from the Cruz Empire. According to Krot's description, they were from the White Legion or even one step closer, They were from one of the White Legion's high-ranking knights. The White Legion had 3 direct knight regiments. The Grey Winged Knights who rode Grey Griffins, the White Dragon Knights who rode Ground Dragons, and the Silver Pegasus Knights. The ones who received these undead should be from the White Dragon Knight Regiment because Krot had seen the insignia under the human's cloak. It was the typical insignia of the White Dragon Regiment. Although the possibility of framing could not be ruled out, it was not very likely. After all, the crew's empire did not know that Krot and the others had fallen into his hands. The White Legion was Constance's staunchest supporter, and the 4 Knights of the Apocalypse were also the most loyal supporters of the Mercury Staff and the backbone of the Reformists. In other words, these undead had entered the Empire to seek the war slate. It was very likely that they had been instructed by both Constance and the Dark Lord. Brando immediately felt that there was a strong smell of conspiracy in the air. He looked at Allium Japonicum, who was listening quietly. She had the same look in her eyes. It wasn't strange for the Mercury Scepter Overlord to know about the war slate's existence. It was an overlord that appeared once in 1,000 years in that world. The Mercury Scepter in its hand had the supreme ability to foresee the future. Through the Mercury Scepter, it could have foreseen the day the war slate would descend into the world. As for the Silver Queen, as the dark dragon of this era who had obtained most of Odin's inheritance, the Dark Prophecy had mentioned that the Dark Dragon had an almost omniscient and omnipotent ability. Through some ancient knowledge and inheritance, it was not strange that she knew about the war slate. What was strange was that the two of them were now together. Throughout history, the opportunity to turn a country from an enemy to a friend was none other than a common interest or an enemy. Speaking of Her Majesty's enemies, other than the Twilight Army and the monsters, it seemed that he was the only one who could be considered an enemy of the Queen. However, Brando did not think that he was worthy of the 2 empires joining hands to deal with him. Then the only thing left was interests. Madara's interests were foreseeable. Being able to seize the war slate from the Empire was naturally beneficial to them. However, what benefits could the Silver Queen gain from this? Inviting a wolf into the house? Just in exchange for Madara's support? Seemed that there was no need. Not to mention that Madara was still not in the right position, and the 4 holy cathedrals, except for a few people in the Holy Cathedral of Fire, did not seem to have any objections to Constance's actions. She did not need to find trouble and get involved with these skeletons. Brando firmly believed that the more ridiculous and illogical something seemed on the surface, the more it was true. Then there must be an unknown truth behind the incident. He suddenly thought of a terrible possibility. Historically, the Empire had allowed and even encouraged Madara to attack Saint Tassel and Erewhon. Would such a thing happen again today? Although it happened at the end of the First Era, in this world even the great demonic wave had been brought forward by so much. Queen Constance was also completely unconventional. There was no reason that this incident could not happen or appear in advance. What are you looking for this thing for? Brando suddenly asked, pointing to the war slate floating at the top of the pile of rubble. Sure enough, the undead knight showed a blank look. Nothing could be seen from the soul fire in its eye sockets. Krot obviously knew nothing about this. This was not beyond Brando's expectations. The war slate had only begun to descend on this world half a month ago, and the fragment of law had only appeared a day ago. These undead did not know what it was, but the existence with the Mercury Staff might have described the appearance of this thing to them, and asked them to come and get it. The world knew the power of the Mercury Staff, so even such a request would not arouse any suspicion. The undead had long been used to their monarch being one step ahead of others. Are you thinking of the war in 422? Allium Japonicum suddenly asked in a whisper. Brando nodded. Great minds think alike. The war in 422 happened before the Battle of Cypher Forest. In that year, the Empire and Madara's envoys signed a secret agreement. This agreement was essentially an agreement to divert the disaster. In the agreement, the Empire would not send more troops to the Cedar area, and even withdraw their troops. In fact, it was allowing Madara to attack Erewhon and Saint Tassel. Not long after that, Madara entered its heyday, which was also the prelude to the destruction of Erewhon. Even the Wind Elves of Saint Tassel were greatly damaged in the war, so there was the Battle of Algash later. He did not expect history to be so similar. Although the Emperor of the Empire was no longer the taciturn Lenoret, Constance also made a shocking decision. At this moment Brando could not help but think that they were really mother and son. However, Brando still did not understand why Constance would let the undead enter the Met's area to obtain the war slate. What was the deeper meaning of her doing so? The Empire's territory was so vast, and there were so many fragments of law and war slate in this land. Why did it have to be Fulton Port? Was it the request of the existence with the Mercury staff, or was it Her Majesty's idea? Could it be that the woman could foresee that he would come to this place? This sounded a little too creepy. A weak voice interrupted his thoughts. Do you remember what I said to you before, human lord? Brando turned around and found that Haku had woken up earlier than he thought. The metal mask on the Black Knight's face had long been shattered by the impact, revealing half of her beautiful face. Her silver hair proved that she was a pure silver elf, but her eyes were no longer as beautiful as Medicia's eyes. Instead, they were replaced by a pair of eyes that were dancing with golden flames. However, this pair of eyes had lost the liveliness that she had when she was trying to coax him, and had returned to an indifferent and emotionless look. Her voice was no longer fluctuating, but filled with a hollow metallic echo. It did not even sound like a woman's voice. In fact, this was the Haku that Brando was familiar with. The origin of Tiama's Choyu in Madara was a mystery. She appeared in Madara about 150 years ago, the first sighting recorded in the literature, or perhaps earlier, but no one knew. No one knew where she came from, and no one knew why she appeared in Madara. However, when she appeared in Madara, she was already a powerful undead lord. By the time the players were familiar with this undead lord, she had already obtained the evil dragon's blood of the bone dragon, Alhin, and was conferred as one of the 4 Knights of the Apocalypse by the Mercury staff. In history, Haku always appeared in a thick robe like this. Although the style and pattern of the robe could change most of the time, there were decorations such as crosses and scales on it, unless she wanted to hide her identity. But no matter what, she would always wear her trademark, the half-crying, half-laughing metal mask. The players, including the players in Madara, had never seen the true face of this knight, and could not tell her gender. Although it did not make any difference to the undead, the players were still interested in guessing this point. Of course, judging from the name, the players were more inclined to the latter guess. And the facts proved to be so. Brando listened to the Black Knight's words and asked, "This is not the first time I've dealt with you, Miss Tiama's Choyu. You've obviously said more than one sentence to me. May I know which sentence you're referring to?" Ancestors. You're an ancestor, a human. You and I both know this deeply. What's an ancestor? Brando frowned. This was indeed the second time this woman had mentioned this word, and it was also referring to him. But he was very puzzled. Brando's origin was very clear. Neither he nor his grandfather were ancestors. Although the Sword Saint Darius was famous, the ancestors of this family were just ordinary Erewhon people. Your understanding of us is beyond the limits of human knowledge, just like how you know my real name and my origin. Even if I didn't tell you when we first met, I know that you already know everything. 2 months ago, I was secretly conferred a title in the Holy Temple of the Dying Moon. This secret has never grown a foot out of Madara, but you already know. I believe that you even know why I was conferred a title, and that my power comes from Spider Mother the Rice. Spider Mother the Rice? Your power doesn't come from the Bone Dragon. Brando was stunned and suddenly realized that something was wrong. He saw the woman looking at him with a sneer and mouthing, "The Master of Darkness will return. It can see through people's hearts and understand all things. Put away your tricks of playing with people's hearts." Allium Japonicum coldly interrupted her. "I will kill you at any time if you dare to do this again." Brando patted his senior's hand and stopped her from continuing. He revealed an "I knew it" expression and asked in return, "So you said that Medicia told me before. This was also to deceive me?" This time Haku did not answer. But Brando did not care and continued to ask in return, "You still think that I'm the Darkness Dragon? But things have changed with the passage of time. Now, others may not necessarily think so. In the Empire, there's someone more worthy of this title than me, isn't there? Darkness will be born from the inhuman, and the honorable people will disappear from the flames." These were the original words of the Dark Prophecy. Allium Japonicum shook his head. Can a person whose age is forever fixed at 15 years old still be considered a human? Only a human can be an inhuman. The Silver Queen Constance is obviously more satisfied with this. She saw some secret on the final battlefield and inherited the power and will of the Darkness Dragon. With the blessing of these powers, she has long become an inhuman existence. No progress, Haku replied. The wisdom of mortals is always limited to this. I never said that you are the Darkness Dragon. That's just a misunderstanding by that little girl Medisha. Brando had lost interest in continuing to listen to her deliberately mystifying words. He asked, "What's your relationship with Medisha?" "I have nothing to do with that bastard." This time Bai Lung replied coldly. Hearing this, Brando was slightly stunned. Then, he looked at the woman with a sullen expression. Hearing this, he confirmed the woman's identity. She was indeed Medisha's sister, just as Medisha described in the dream. He turned his head and no longer looked at the woman. He had obtained enough information. He looked at Krot. "Krot, as far as I know, you are not the most trusted subjects of the Darkness Dragon. Why would it send you to carry out this mission?" This was just a euphemism. In fact, it was not as simple as not being close to the Darkness Dragon. The so-called fence-sitters, to put it bluntly, were the dark nobles who were forced by the power of the Mercury Staff to submit to the Darkness Dragon. These old nobles were the least powerful group in this new empire. For an important mission like going to the Cruz Empire, it was absolutely impossible for them to be given to them. In fact, Krot was at a loss about this point. However, she looked at Haku with some fear and was unwilling to answer. Just from this simple glance, Brando and Allium Japonicum had already obtained what they wanted. "If I'm not wrong, she took the initiative to ask the Darkness Dragon to allow you to join, right?" Brando asked. Krot's soulfire was clearly filled with astonishment. Brando thought to himself that this was indeed the case. This woman's followers were all fence-sitters, and she herself was the most loyal knight of the Darkness Dragon with the Mercury Staff. It would be too much of a coincidence to say that there was nothing fishy about this. Generally speaking, birds of a feather flock together. If he were to carry out this mission, he would definitely choose a few like-minded and trustworthy helpers. Or rather, these people were personally appointed by the Darkness Dragon, and Haku had no right to say anything. However, this was obviously not possible. Why would the Darkness Dragon offend its most reliable subordinates for a few fence-sitters? This was obviously not logical. And after he asked, he found out that there was indeed something unusual about this. Why would Haku choose a few fence-sitters who had no loyalty to the Mercury Staff as his teammates? Others might think that she was trying to cultivate her own circle and buy people's hearts, but Brando was very familiar with this woman. In her life, other than those unintelligent skeletons under her command, she was alone. She did not have any followers at all. Although the world had changed, Brando had never seen a historical figure whose temperament changed drastically because of the changes in the future. He believed that Haku was no exception. He wanted to ask more, but the Black Knight interrupted him angrily. "Don't ask anymore. What do you want to know, human lord? Let's make a deal." There's definitely something fishy going on. Brendel could not help but take a long look at Lorison's undead. This tall skeleton knight was still motionless like a stone statue. Oh! Chapter 1010. The cryptic clock tower was located at the top of Fatin City. The 12th generation of the empire's architecture was filled with a religious and solemn style unique to that era. Looking out from the long and narrow window on one side of the clock tower, one could see the seaside scenery of Facus. The blue horizon was level with the sky, and long headlands and lighthouses were deep in the sea. Yuta chose this place as her temporary office because she could overlook the whole city and its surroundings. However, Medisha always felt that she preferred the narrow space to give her a sense of security. It was said that her room in Abies was such a small room that it looked like a fortress from the outside. There were many inconveniences in working in such a place, but Medisha had always been a resigned person, so she agreed. Eugenie, the daughter of Duke Viro, was a little dissatisfied, but she did not insist on objecting. At this moment the sun had just risen, and a thin light shone into the room. The long shadow extended along the corner of the table, embellishing the decorative crystal on the table. Medisha frowned slightly and reached out to move it to the side. The crystal was slightly transparent under the sunlight, casting a faint yellow shadow on the sheepskin on the table. It was a letter filled with ciphertext. This ancient language was passed down from generation to generation by the Silver Elves. Now it was taught by Medisha and was only used by the White Lion Guards. Eugenie, Vero and Marjorie stood behind her, waiting for the fairy princess to read the letter. After a moment, Medisha sighed and put down the letter. The sunlight made a silhouette of her. On her side, the dragon rock wooden window frame was used as a picture frame for the view of the harbor. However, Fatin had already closed the harbor, and the harbor was as calm as a mirror. "What's wrong, Miss Medisha?" Eugenie asked after a while. She thought that Medisha would always speak according to the usual opening, but this time, the fairy princess fell into an unsettling silence. Medisha put down the letter and shook her head. "There's no news. The White Legion is still biding their time. I asked the scouts to approach the Levea Valley and the Golden Needle Forest, but they are still silent. This silence makes me uneasy." "What about the villagers?" In the corner of the room, Delphian sat in a wheelchair. The place she was in was completely dark, leaving only a calm eye emitting a faint light in the darkness. The Silver Dragon Lady stood behind Delphine. Ever since Mithril saved this little human girl, she admired Delphine's wisdom more and more. She often stayed by Delphine's side in the name of observing the patients. Perhaps Delphine was grateful to Mithril for saving her life, so she did not object. "That's what I'm worried about." Medisha gently folded the paper and handed it to the two people behind her. Then, Eugenie and Marjorie passed it to Mithril and finally to Delphian. The Prime Minister's daughter pinched the sheepskin between her thumb and forefinger without saying a word. The scar on her face seemed to have been carved with a knife, bright and dark, and the words on the sheepskin were written in golden lines. The villagers did not make any move. The White Legion, the villagers of the Latch of Wa. This is the military force that Constance can mobilize in the Metz area. Now they are biding their time. What's so strange about this? The Duke's daughter's eyebrows were full of annoyance, just like her complaining tone. Is Her Majesty still planning to target Ludwig first? Marjorie asked tentatively. That's impossible. Delphian interrupted him firmly. Her gaze fell on the sheepskin again. She hesitated silently and said, "Maybe she's waiting for an opportunity." "Waiting for what opportunity?" Eugenie asked. "That's possible." Medisha rubbed her forehead, thought for a while and explained, "I also think that Miss Delphian's guess is right. The eldest prince is at Fathan Port. As long as he is alive, he will become the remaining pillar of faith for the northern nobles in the Holy Cathedral. Once Fathan is conquered, the North's dilemma will be solved. This is also the reason why Duke Vina has repeatedly sent letters asking us to go to Yuma City in the Favor Forest. Constance can't see this. His Majesty is unwilling to move because he wants to set up a battlefield in Fathan. But Fathan is not a good battlefield. Although the east side is a long and narrow mountain path, the northwest side is flat and open. The hills are also good for hiding troops. It's easy to attack but hard to defend. Marjorie was quite opposed to this plan. This was not the first time that he had questioned it. Delphian was quite disdainful. His Majesty has already arranged the plan. What we need to do is to execute this plan to the best of its ability, not to discuss whether the plan is feasible or not. She sneered. My time is limited. I'm here to listen to Miss Medisha's constructive ideas. As for the others, please keep your mouth shut. Marjorie's face was quite unpleasant, but he did not want to argue with a woman. He looked at the ugly woman coldly and did not speak anymore. Delphian's words angered Eugenie, who was beside her. The eldest daughter of the Duke sneered. The word His Majesty is really catchy. Medisha saw that the Prime Minister's daughter had revealed her true nature. She was a little helpless. Okay, stop arguing. She gently interrupted Delphian's next words. She knew that if this woman continued to speak, the situation would get out of hand, just like the previous few times. Back to the topic. Do you have any other ideas? Delphian saw that Medisha had spoken, so she did not fight back. However, she did not speak easily either. The Silver Dragon Lady behind her suddenly said, Are they waiting for the army at the Evergreen Corridor? The army of Georgandy Ridge and the Lion Men. Except for Delphian, everyone's eyes lit up slightly. However, the light in Medisha's eyes quickly dimmed. She shook her head and said, The army of the Dukes is also gathering. Constance must seize every second. If she does not want this civil war to drag on for years. His Majesty thinks so too. He knows that woman will not wait for years. She will definitely seize this opportunity. How can she wait for the army of Georgandy Ridge and the Lion Men to arrive on the battlefield? She must have other plans, Delphian replied with certainty. That's why she can be so fearless. We have to find a way to make that woman show her tail. What good ideas do you have? Eugenie retorted. The eyes of the Prime Minister's daughter glowed, like a leopard showing its fangs and claws on the hunt. It's very simple. Constance's commander is not moving, which means that the best time for them has not yet come. We don't want to give them this opportunity so that this opportunity will never come. We will take the initiative to attack Ovchin, the Olivia Valley and the Golden Needle Forest. You're crazy. The Duke's daughter was shocked. Marjorie was also shocked, but the professional sergeant quickly reacted and showed a thoughtful look. Medisha was slightly startled. She bent her head and gently tapped the tip of her smooth jade-like chin. This plan seems to be feasible, she said thoughtfully. As long as we modify the details a little. Eugenie saw that the three of them seemed to be serious. She was not proficient in military affairs, so she could not help but hesitate. Do we need to inform the Count? Of course. The fairy princess at this moment was the commander of the Imperial Guards. She immediately made a decision. We also need to inform Yuta. Without her warrant you can't mobilize the White Lion Guards. She seemed to have just realized that one person was missing. She could not help but ask. By the way, where is Madame Yuta? She seems to have gone to patrol in person because she was worried that the information was wrong. Medisha smiled bitterly and shook her head. This lady. The Golden Needle Valley was like a gray sea. The tall shining silver trees were like soldiers in gray armor. The snow-white trunks stood upright, and the branches twisted and climbed up. After midsummer, autumn arrived in the forest. The ground was covered with a thick layer of gray leaves. Several knights rode their horses to the side of an ancient tree. They were fully equipped and armed. On their shoulder armor was a white lion with shining fur. The female knight in the lead lifted her mask. Her fiery red hair flowed down from under the metal mask, revealing a beautiful face that made people drool. Her emerald eyes swept across the tree trunk. She raised the spear in her hand and pointed at one of the branches. What is this? Where the tip of her spear pointed, the tree trunk was crisscrossed by sharp weapons. It was strange and winding, as if it was wriggling and coming back to life. It was unpleasant. This is a secret mark left by the mountain people, my lady. One of the knight glanced at the tree and replied in a low muffled voice. The survivors of the Latch of Wa have been using this set of secret marks for thousands of years. Only they know what it means. Yuta looked around. The forest was as silent as a ghost. The cold wind swept through the treetops, and then whispers sounded in the forest. She was not afraid. She raised the spear and drew a circle around herself. This used to be the mountain people's territory? Here, and the north of the Golden Needle Forest, including the Olivia Valley. The knight replied respectfully. The mountain people have been hiding here for thousands of years. It is precisely because they are in the north that the White Legion dares to station their troops in Ahin, a place surrounded by valleys on three sides. But with this forest, Ahin is the most important strategic location in the south of Komixin. Then where are they now? The knight was speechless. He hesitated. Someone saw them go north. The local hunters said that as early as a week ago, the mountain people here began a mass migration. There is no one left in the forest now. Jana turned around, her emerald green eyes flashing with dissatisfaction at this answer. Why did they go north? She asked. The mountains of the Latch of Wa are the homeland of the mountain people. Why did they leave after getting this land? Mare, you are also a mountain person. Would you leave your homeland? I know the mountain people very well because the blood of the mountain people flows in my veins. They will not leave their homeland easily. She frowned uneasily. There must be a conspiracy behind this. But the question is, where did they go? The knight muttered softly. They went on a pilgrimage. The Latch appeared and wound again. The Latch was the Holy One of the mountain people. The legend of him was passed down from generation to generation. It was said that he saved the mountain people from the claws of the evil god Tardis Sion in the present-day Varaka. The mountain winds in the Latch of Wa still carried his name. Occasionally, the forest would whisper about this legend. The Latch of Wa meant the homeland of the Holy One in the language of the mountain people. Therefore, it was regarded as a sacred land by the mountain people. Yuta spat softly. That pretentious woman. She was talking about Constance. Her tone was full of disdain. When did the dark dragon become the Holy One of the mountain people? Although the Myurnas once ruled the mountain people for a period of time, they were not better off than now. The knight shook his head. I am not too sure about this, my lord. He looked ahead. The shadows of the trees overlapped and made him uneasy. He hesitated. Should we continue? The female knight, however, raised a finger. Her face was suddenly covered in a pale white that had lost all its color. Shua, Yuta replied solemnly. Did you hear something? The forest was whispering. The rustling of footsteps was like insects crawling on the ground. Haku's words finally had a miraculous effect. There was a moment of silence in the underground round hall. A beam of light shone down from the dome. Specks of light danced in the bright light and dust floated up and down. In the intertwining light and darkness, Lorison's undead statue was like a stone statue. Only the soul fire in his rib cavity was burning vigorously. A stone rolled down from the broken pillar, making a hollow echo. It rolled to the feet of the Allium Japonicum. The female knight bent down and picked it up. Brando turned around. He looked at Haku condescendingly and narrowed his dark brown eyes. Before we talk about the conditions, take out the thing first. Haku's expression changed. What thing? You know. Haku's expression changed several times. In the end, he nodded hesitantly. Take it. She took out a gemstone that shone like an agate and threw it to Brando. Brando reached out and caught it firmly in his hand. It was cold to the touch, but there was a warm feeling inside. There was no doubt that this gemstone was the extremely precious item from his previous life, the fragment of the natural order. At least you know what's good for you, Brando replied. You can tell me now. What do you want to hear? Everything. But the key is the deal between Her Majesty the Queen and that person. Haku's expression gradually darkened. If I tell you everything, then what other trump cards do I have? Human, this is not the way to negotiate a deal. Brando smiled. If he was not familiar with this woman, he might have been fooled. He shook his head and did not mind. If you really think so, Madame Tiamas, he said, dragging his voice. Mr. Krot. Enough. Haku was almost roaring. The dead had long lost the right to breathe, but her chest rose and fell rapidly, as if she recalled her instincts when she was alive. The key to the deal is in your hands. Brando glanced at the fragment of the natural order in his hand. In my hands? Of course I know it's in my hands. But what benefit does Constance get from it? He said in surprise. I don't think the Silver Queen is a philanthropist who only wants to give without asking for anything in return. You're asking the wrong question, Bai Lung said with a smile. You should ask, what benefit does Madara get from it? Brando opened his hand. The agate-like gemstone shone in the center of his palm. The soft light shone in all directions, reflecting on his pale cheeks. But he immediately retracted his hand and frowned. He realized that this question might not be so simple. What does this mean? He asked. Don't keep me in suspense. You should know that my patience is limited. There are a few places in the White Mountain where the sun never rises again. A new kind of order has been formed there, and the undead can be greatly strengthened in that land. The land of the dead moon. A voice in Brando's head buzzed. He suddenly thought of a possibility. P.S. I'm a little late because I'm thinking of the plot. Don't worry. Chapter 10-11. Brendel's eyebrows turned gloomy. How many troops did Madara send this time? He suddenly asked. 6, as you can see. Haku showed a very disdainful expression, but he had to answer. They are all here, human. 6? Bai Lung snorted, and her eyes fell on Krot. You will know whether I am lying or not when you ask. Brando looked at the woman suspiciously. He knew that she was not lying, and there was no need for her to lie about this kind of thing. He had already thought of the possibilities, but he was curious about why the woman pretended to be angry. She had been creating this illusion from the beginning, But the real Tiamat was not like this. The Black Knight would never be angry, and he rarely got angry. How could a person who despised emotional thinking let anger control his thinking? Haku must not know how familiar Brando and Allium Japonicum knew her. If she knew that Brando and Allium Japonicum were treating her like a clown, she might really be angry. Brando felt a strong sense of uneasiness in his heart. Some of the memories of the land of the dead moon were still vivid in his mind. The dark mountains of the Arkash region, the mountains were full of undead, and the land was full of corpses. Madara was not the only undead. In the mountains to the east of Mihodafen, there were countless souls of the dead. It was not only the Holy War decades ago, but also the previous wars and the Great War more than 1,000 years ago. Countless crews, Fanzan, elves and warriors of other races were buried here. Some necromancers who had lived in seclusion since ancient times operated their own secret lairs in the depths of the mountains. Even these people would respond to the call of the Mercury Staff. If the Silver Queen gave up the area to the east of Metz, and let Madara turn it into the land of the dead moon, then the one with the Mercury Staff would be able to summon an army and wreak havoc in this area. But from Mihodafen to the wilderness of 4 realms, that was a full 1/3 of the empire. Unless that woman was really crazy, she wouldn't dare to do such a crazy thing. But perhaps Constance had really fallen into hysteria. All the speculation seemed to point to this possibility. Even if Brando didn't want to believe it, he had to plant a seed of doubt. He stared at Bai with a gloomy expression. Originally, he did not expect this woman to speak, but he did not expect Bai to smile coldly. They have reached an agreement. No one knows what it is about. She stared into Brando's eyes and said, "But other than me, Kalafen, Yalvit and Greta have all gone to Al-Kash. Even in Madara, only a few people know about this secret." The decaying Night Crot wriggled on the ground uneasily, her jaw cracking. No one knew if she was uneasy because it was the first time she heard this news, or because Bai dared to reveal that person's secret. Brando didn't care at all. He didn't have the mind to pay attention to other things. His mind was almost completely attracted by this sentence. Kalafen, Yalvit and Greta had all gone to Al-Kash. Kalafen, the lord of the Duchy of Griffin, was the most powerful traditional dark noble in Madara. He was also one of the most powerful lords in Madara in this era. His strength was above Bai, who had obtained the blood of the evil dragon. But although this person was an old noble, he was loyal to the Mercury Staff and was that person's true confidant. Yalvit. Hearing this name, Brando even asked, "Has the Queen of the White Demonesses submitted to that person?" This was earlier than he expected, but in any case, this did not stop the name from being dazzling. Yalvit, the Queen of the White Demonesses, was the most powerful of the few forces that resisted the Mercury Staff. After she submitted to the Mercury Staff, the Empire of Madara began to move towards true unification. Finally, there was Greta, the death-praying sword, the sword of the Empire, and the greatest sword saint of the next era. Some people called the era before 375 the era of the Earth Sword Saint Darius, and the era after 375 the era of the death-praying sword Saint Greta. In this half a century, there was only one gray sword Saint Mephistopheles, but the 2 sword saints before and after that were truly powerful figures that made the whole continent bow down to. At present, Greta should only be Motherwell's apprentice. The latter was the father of the famous one-eyed dragon Tarkus. He was also a very famous dark sword saint. It was said that his strength was on par with Mephisto, but that was before Mephisto entered the ultimate realm. Brando estimated that this person's strength would not surpass Veronica's at most. Not to mention that Motherwell had met Greta, a once-in-a-thousand-years genius. Greta was born in the Boneyard Forest on the coast of the Sea of the Dying Moon. According to the player's investigation, he should have been a human living nearby. He was only 16 years old when he died. Later, he was awakened as a lesser blood descendant. Originally, there were thousands of undead in Madara who were awakened by necromancers or superior vampires every day. In theory, Greta should have become one of those thousands of low-level undead cannon fodder and died in an inconspicuous battle in the Sea of the Dying Moon. But history was such a coincidence. The person who awakened him was Motherwell. Not only was he a sword saint, but he was also the patriarch of the Manlian family. Greta quickly attracted Motherwell's attention with his unique soul fire, and became the latter's apprentice. After that, He embarked on the path of a brilliant genius and became the most dazzling star in Madara's history. The sword of the Empire, Greta, died together with Ekis in the final battle of the Evernight. He pierced the right eye of the Alpha Wolf with his sword. Some people said that if he did not die, Madara's expansion might not stop at the wilderness of 4 realms. Brando also agreed with this statement. Such a person's strength at this time might not be as strong as White, but he was that person's trusted aide. He, Coliphon, and Yalvit. The fact that the 3 of them went to Algash was enough to explain a lot of things. Brando thought of many things at that moment, but he really could not understand why Constance would make such a choice. He could imagine what would happen next. It would definitely subvert everyone's understanding of this world. Hypothetically, a third of the Empire suddenly fell into Madara's hands. A vacuum would suddenly appear between Cruz, Saint-Tossel, and Fanzan. This land of the dead moon would completely change the structure of the continent. It was equivalent to the crazy queen bringing the dead moon empire into the course of history in advance. This was definitely a method that was much crazier than the empire in history. Brando, Allium Japonicum suddenly reminded him. Although Constance is crazy, she is definitely not crazy. She must have a deeper reason for doing this. Brendel's eyes lit up. This was a negotiation between the 2 empires, not a game between children. Such a large-scale handover was definitely not something that could be completed in a short period of time. But what exactly made the existence with the Mercury staff and the Silver Queen trust each other so much? For a plan of this scale, Madara and Cruz must have a considerable degree of mutual trust to complete it. But how did these 2 gain each other's trust? The Dark Dragon. White seemed to have seen through his doubts and answered with a devilish voice. That's impossible. Brando growled. Although the world knew that the undead of Madara were once loyal to the Dark Dragon, thousands of years later, they had already become independent. Could it be that Constance, with the title of the Dark Dragon, could convince the existence with the Mercury staff to bow down to her? This was a little too unimaginable. How could the existence of the Dark Kingdom, a king that appeared once in 1,000 years, be willing to bow down to someone with his ambition? Not to mention that he was now fully fledged. After Yalvit submitted to him, the empire was on the fast track. The next 100 years would be Madara's era. Would that person bow down to Constance just based on a rumor? This was simply a joke. Not to mention that Constance only had a part of the Dark Dragon's inheritance in her hands. Even if she really obtained the entire inheritance, she was still not Odin. Brando even thought that the woman in front of him was insulting his intelligence and making fun of him, but White looked very serious. She looked at the human in front of her with contempt, as if she already knew that the other party would have such an expression. She replied coldly, "But that's the truth. I even know that Constance and that person met in private before, on the final battlefield. Few people know the details of that meeting, but at least I'm sure that they reached an agreement. I even know that after this plan is completed, Madara will definitely be merged into the Cruz Empire. Of course, at that time, Cruz will no longer be called Cruz. The new country will be called Mardos. The new country will be called Mardos." A voice echoed on the ground. The Azure Knight held the holy lance in his hand and made a promise to the people on the ground. For the next 10,000 years, this country thrived on the ruins of the past. It was the Myrna Empire, the country that had been destroyed for 1,000 years. Brando felt that the world had gone crazy, or rather he had gone crazy. He felt someone gently supporting his back. It was the gentleness of his senior. He turned around and saw Allium Japonicum standing firmly by his side. He immediately understood the other party's thoughts and was slightly touched. Ever since he heard White's words, although he still couldn't tell if it was true or false, there was still a dark cloud shrouding his heart. The future of this world was completely out of his control. The tide of the world was blowing in his face. In the face of the storm, no one dared to say that they knew what their fate was going to be. Even he was the same. He originally thought that he could finally control the fate of Erwin, but in the current situation, Erwin was like a lonely boat in a tsunami that could capsize at any time. In front of these giants, Erwin people still couldn't control their own fate. For a moment, Brando suddenly felt that his heart was very tired. But with Allium Japonicum standing by his side, he suddenly felt that he had returned to the past. The future of the kingdom was gloomy. The fate of the entire kingdom and its people, the faith and hope of thousands of Erewhon players, were all floating on the stormy sea. Although everyone knew that they could fail or even that they had failed, they still stayed. At least I did it before and I won't regret it. They had failed before, and it left a deep impression on him that was enough to affect his life. But this time they might not fail. Besides, with the same person standing by his side, how could he not have the courage to fight again? No matter what it was, as long as it stood in his way, he would make it pay the price. Mardos had been destroyed by the hands of the four wise ones 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years later, the result would not change. I understand, senpai, Brando replied softly. Allium Japonicum showed a gratified look and nodded. But Brando knew that now was not the time to comfort each other. The most important thing now was to solve the problem at hand. He looked at White and asked coldly, "How far has this plan gone?" He paused for a moment, and a complicated light flashed in his eyes as if he had understood something. "The White Legion is not moving in Ovchin. Is it waiting for you? Do you believe it now?" White asked. Brando looked at this woman, and he was a little disgusted. "I'll take what you said as the truth, Miss Tiamas." But he still answered patiently, "Actually, I'm very clear about your little tricks and what you want to do. But now you should know which side you should be on. I hope that you can show me your true sincerity to cooperate with me." "I'm on your side." Bai Lung laughed and said, "Human, are you mistaken? Although I brought these trash with me," she looked at Krot and did not hide her contempt for these trash, "this only shows that I have my own thoughts. That person's subordinates, Yalvit, the Queen of Banshees, and Colifen, the King of Griffins, do not have their own plans. This is nothing." "Don't beat around the bush," Brando interrupted her coldly. "I've always been suspicious of your attitude, but your words later revealed the truth. You brought these fence-sitters out not because you have your own plans or indeed because you have your own plans, because you know that they won't dare to question your decision. Compared to them, you are far closer to that person, and in front of them you have supreme authority." White's expression changed slightly, but he did not say anything. Instead, he quietly waited for Brando to continue. "Actually, you didn't lie before, Tiamas," Brando replied. "Your real goal is Lorison's undead, right?" "I don't understand what you mean, human." White smiled. Brando pondered for a moment, then raised his head. "I didn't want to say it, but in order to not deceive each other in the future, I think it's better to be honest," he said. "White or Miss Tiamas Choyu in this world, there is an organization called the Hydra's 12 Heads. May I ask which head you are?" He asked word by word. "Patriarch Tiamas, can you answer me?" The smile on the undead lady's face froze. "Oh." Chapter 10:12. The golden flame in Bai's eyes split into layers of flame patterns, like flowing lava. She squeezed out a few words from her throat. "What are you talking about?" Because of this. Brando raised his hand and a crystal drew a beautiful arc in the air, making a crisp sound as it hit the ground, and then rolled to Bai's feet. Bai hesitated for a moment, then leaned over to pick up the thing with difficulty. It was a dark crystal without any luster, exuding a cold aura in her palm. The color in the center of the crystal had been removed, revealing an ugly blank space. Bai carefully observed for a moment, and finally recognized that the crystal was one of the culprits who had plotted against her. Her brows furrowed deeply. "This is a soul crystal?" "This is a soul crystal," Brando replied. "It once stored a spell called Soul Spike, which is a black magic." "What does this have to do with me?" Brando raised his head and looked at the empty round hall. The towering vault was engraved with thorns, light and shadow, and gargoyles stood gloomily on the stone pillars. It was said that the top of each stone pillar was engraved with prayers like Atshvan, the glory of the kings, praising the Lord of Light, the sun god Perkin. The building could show the time of the era it belonged to, and this hall was filled with the history of the past hundreds of years. "It should have nothing to do with me," he said. "But how could a believer of the sun god perform black magic and hide such an evil thing in his sanctuary?" Bai's eyes showed a thoughtful look, and she saw Allium Japonicum behind Brando walk out. Allium Japonicum smiled at her politely, and in a gentle tone he continued Brando's words. "Sir John Lorison was a true devout believer when he was alive. He was an upright and noble knight, but he also had his own story. Many people may not believe that this upright knight had never broken his connection with the word cultist in his life, but it was the truth. He was also exiled because of this stain, and could not return to his homeland and family. Of course, this was a deeply buried secret. Outsiders thought that the knight had left because he was tired of fighting for power. Naturally, the family he came from would do everything possible to cover up the truth that shamed the family. Thus, the real history was forgotten day after day, just like this hall, where everything in the past was covered in dust. But history is silent, and time will tell everything. No matter how deeply the secret is buried, it will inadvertently reveal itself. A long time later, a ranger named Verdant found a diary in the ruins of a castle in Grano. He opened the diary that was covered in crimson goatskin. On the first page, the name of the owner of the diary was written in elegant handwriting. Her name was Gladys Petty. Her real identity was Lorison's wife. She was a tree shepherd. At this point, she stopped and did not intend to continue. Brando continued. I've been thinking about this question before. No matter how the tide of magic roared and set off waves on the sea, how could Perkin tolerate so many undead running rampant in his sanctuary? But when I saw this round hall, I understood that this hall was not Perkin's chanting hall, but the holy cellar, the altar used by Perkin's followers to seal the evil monsters underground. So the reason why the undead exist here is so simple. It's because they have been here for a long time. Even so, it doesn't mean anything. Indeed, but the problem is that you gave yourself away. Don't forget that you used the awakening witchcraft on Lorison. That's not strange, Bai Lung said coldly. I'm the Dark Lord of Madara. It's normal for me to search for powerful undead as my subordinates. Then you can use it to command the undead. Why did you awaken Lorison's wisdom? That's because the high-grade undead with wisdom are more powerful. Brando shook his head. In theory that's true. But Lorison's undead still retains the heart of a saint. It's a real saint's soul. Even if it wakes up and can't attack you because of the powerful magic of the awakening witchcraft, it will still choose to self-destruct. What you will get is not a powerful follower, but a pile of bones. The awakening witchcraft scroll is expensive. The Empire of Madara is not powerful enough to squander it. You dared to do this because you need Lorison to recover his memories. Only as the designer and builder of this holy cellar, he is qualified to provide you with what you want. The way to unlock the seal of this holy cellar and release Glace Petty's soul. I'm almost amazed by your wonderful hypothesis. Human, I didn't expect you to know about the undead. Your understanding of the world of the undead is deeper than I thought. I'm curious. You're only about 20 years old. What made you understand the secrets of the undead? If you say that you're a wizard who specializes in undead witchcraft and black magic, I'll believe it. But you're just a swordsman, and the youngest swordsman in 1,000 years. Haku said lightly. Unfortunately, a hypothesis is still a hypothesis. It may have many coincidences with reality, but it's still just a subjective speculation. You still don't have any evidence to support what you said. Since when do human nobles need evidence to convict people? Andrea suddenly opened her mouth and said impatiently, in my opinion, this is all nonsense. You can't resist anyway. If this human wants you to be hanged or on a bed, it's just a matter of words. Why do you have to be so pretentious and waste your time? That's why I say that your understanding of humans is not as good as mine. Brando was almost choked to death by this sentence. He really didn't know if this sentence was praising him or taking the opportunity to speak ill of him. But the vampire princess looked serious. It seemed like she agreed with his words. Haku smiled and sneered. Others may do this, but I know that your lord won't. Brando knew that Haku was deliberately provoking him, but he didn't care. He shook his head. I have reservations about your opinion. Under certain circumstances, I don't care about the means. Otherwise, I won't listen to a cultist like you. But right now, I won't lower myself to the same level as you. If I say that you're a tree herder, I will naturally have accurate evidence. Speaking of which, this evidence was actually given to me by you. Haku's face was a little ugly. Anyone who was described in such a vulgar way would feel angry, let alone a proud person like her. But she wasn't angry, at most she was a little dissatisfied. Brando continued. Miss Tiamas, do you still remember what you said to me before? This question sounds very familiar, Haku replied. And my answer is similar. I have said many things to you before. I wonder which one your excellency is asking? That sentence itself isn't important, but when I took out the god-slaying magic breaking all you mentioned Amon. Haku's face changed. So what? Speaking of which, you killed a high-ranking priest of the Holy Cathedral, and you still dare to appear in the Empire openly. You're really bold. Why beat around the bush, Miss Tiamas? Since I mentioned this name, you should know that I already know Amon's other identity. He is a high-ranking member of All for One. I dare say that in this world, there are no more than 10 people who know of this person's dual identity, including me. But you were able to call out his name immediately, which means that you already knew that he died in the loop of trade winds and what he was doing there. The Black Knight of Madara's face was as cold as water. That idiot. She cursed under her breath, and at the same time admitted to everything Brando had hypothesized. Her pride didn't allow her to continue denying, because she knew that it was meaningless. Some things could be said to be coincidences, but coincidences couldn't explain everything. Haku looked at Brando with his golden eyes and asked curiously, I have another question that I'm curious about. Amon is a member of All for One. Why do you insist that I'm a tree herder and one of the 12 patriarchs? Brando hesitated for a moment but still answered, Actually, the reason is relatively simple. It's because All for One doesn't accept the undead. All for One members have always looked down on the undead and the necromancy. They think that it's just a path that's corrupted by dark magic. What they pursue is the truth of chaos, the true eternity. It's not something that the skeletons of Madara can compare to. At that time, Amon's state made me suspicious. Although it could only mean that he was secretly practicing the forbidden necromancy and turning himself into an undead before he died, it was enough to attract my attention. After that, I always thought that Amon went to the loop of trade winds for the inheritance of the Dark Dragon. It wasn't until you called out his name that I realized something. His goal is the same as Andesh's. He's going for the blood of God in the Dark Dragon. That's the blood of a true descendant of the gods. It's completely different from the trash blood of God you've cultivated. Brando didn't say anything, and that was that he had experienced it firsthand. He was definitely more qualified than anyone else to speak about it. As for why Haku was a patriarch, that was another story. A person could hide a secret for a while, but it was difficult to hide it forever. In fact, many players in the Amber Sword suspected that Haku was one of the tree herders, death god Choka of the 12 patriarchs. He was the patriarch who controlled the power of life and death. Although Haku was Madara's Black Knight and displayed her exquisite skills in the field of the undead most of the time, including her ability to manipulate people's minds, everyone knew that she had many trump cards that she had never revealed. As a lone knight, her strength was the weakest among the 4 knights of the apocalypse, and yet she was able to retain her position. That was why Brando said that Haku was the patriarch. His guess seemed to have been confirmed. He could imagine that this title must have been inherited from the evil dragon's blood. From the name of this inheritance, it could be deduced that it was also a type of blood of God. Bai was completely silent. It was probably because she was at a loss when her trump card was completely exposed. She was silent for a while before slowly asking, Since you already know my identity and I've chosen to work with you, can you set me free again? Of course not. Brando replied frankly. But you told me so much before because you wanted me to create some trouble for Constance and that person. Because you don't want to see civilization and order reunited under the name of an empire. Only chaos meets your demands. You are paving the way for the Twilight Dragon, and All for One is doing the same. In that case, why don't you be more straightforward? You want me to be a stumbling block for the revival of the Mardos Empire. Why don't you expect me to do more? Haku looked at him with a complicated expression. Do you think you can compete with those 2 people? One of them is the incarnation of the Dark Dragon resurrected on this earth, the ruler in the prophecy. The other is the king that Madara has been waiting for 1,000 years. She will bring an era that belongs to the dead moon. The 2 of them are the echoes of the order of this era. This is the general trend of civilization. Except for the Twilight Dragon, no one can be an enemy. Don't you think you are too arrogant, human? The more arrogant I am, the better it is for you, Brando replied. That's true. So if you want me to create enough trouble for Constance, Please tell me more details. Very well, Bai Lung said with a smile. What do you want to know? I said everything. Well, you can breathe a sigh of relief for the time being, human. The Silver Queen did not intend to mobilize the undead in the Alkash Mountains. She did not have the ability to do so for the time being, but the eastern part of Metz has been the traditional sphere of influence of the tree herders for hundreds of years. There are huge dark forces hiding here. Lori-san is just a victim of the struggle between the dark forces and the church in the past 100 years. The relationship is too complicated, so I won't repeat it one by one. You just need to know one thing. There is more than one person like Lorisan's wife in this place. They have many identities such as dark sorcerers, cultists, or something else. 100 years ago, the church suddenly launched a great purge, and the end result was that our forces here were uprooted, and All for One was also hit hard. However, we did not let the Holy Cathedral get away with it. The disputes that lasted for decades and the subsequent holy war between the three empires were all caused by us, Haku said proudly. But the audience next to her felt a chill down their spine. The dispute between the light and the dark forces eventually led to rivers of blood on the continent, and behind this was only the ambition and revenge of a few people. Brando had secretly made up his mind that he must not let this woman and the tree herders exist anymore. Even if she was really related to Medisha, Haku might have seen through his plan, or she might not have noticed it at all, but she did not care. She continued, back to the Great Purge 100 years ago, among the dark forces that were uprooted at that time, a small number of people were executed, but most of them were secretly imprisoned or sealed. For example, the tainted bloodlord Rockwell was caught and imprisoned at that time. The reason for this is very complicated, but the main reason is that the dark forces have completely eroded the noble class of the empire. If this scar is completely uncovered, not only will the empire be bruised and bruised, it may even bleed to death. As a result, the church's stubbornness caused a backlash from the nobles. At that time, the empire was fighting both openly and secretly, and the truth and lies were intertwined, causing very few people to really understand what happened in the empire during this period. In short, the final result was that the influence of the church plummeted, and the imperial power returned to the religious power under the support of the nobles. Only then did Brando understand the truth behind the struggle between the religious power and the imperial power. Perhaps from that time onwards, the Cruz Empire began to unavoidably begin to go downhill, and All for One was able to infiltrate the nobles and even the church unscrupulously. Everything in this world must have a cause and a result, and there was no exception. In short, the final result is that most of the dark creatures are buried deep underground, together with the secrets of the nobles, just like this holy cellar. And these people who have been eroded by the dark, as well as those who have fallen in the struggle, are a group of people who are most likely to be turned into undead by the dark magic after they die. The Silver Queen obviously knew this, and I came here on the order of that person to help her get back her authority. Authority? Brando did not quite understand this word. Chapter 10:13. Beneath the rolling hills of East Metz, under the low clouds and forest mist, there were intricate caves buried deep in the ground. There were countless ruins in the darkness, and many living creatures and the dead were entangled in them. They came out at night and rested during the day. There were folk songs and stories about them that were passed down from generation to generation in Metz, and the old people would occasionally mention these creepy stories. However, according to the legends, husbands used to teach their wives, and mothers used to scare their sons. The horror under the night sky and the whispers in the forest were scattered by the wind of summer and autumn, lingering for hundreds of years. This dark power was only in the hands of a few of the most powerful dark lords. They were called Grand Dukes. In history, there were 3 Grand Dukes in Metz. The first one was Baron Snorway of Ovchin. He controlled the world of darkness for 30 years before his death and 30 years after his death. He was once canonized as a saint, and at the same time he was also a necromancer. One of them was a profound necromancer. He deceived the world until 60 years after his death before he was dug out from his grave and burned to ashes. His authority was sealed in a crown by the Holy Cathedral and stored under the prison of Thorn Island. Later it was stolen during the Age of Chaos and was completely lost. The second one was the famous witch Ludwig. She spread her followers in the forest of the Silver Valley, attracting wizards, bandits and mercenaries who were inclined to the dark to join her cult. In that era, everyone knew that Ludwig's day belonged to the Duke, and the night belonged to the Witch Queen. Even the whispers of the wind through the forest did not dare to mention her name. Travelers kept their mouths shut. Merchants and knights did not even dare to approach the forest at night. In the end, the witch died at the hands of Paladin Luther. Her heart was nailed to the Perkin Shrine in Sweetwater Harbor by a wooden spike. The holy flame burned on it all year round, and it was said that mournful screams could still be heard from it. Cold winds blew around the shrine all year round, causing passers-by to take a detour. Until today, the statue of the Holy Knight still existed in the 3 harbors of East Metz. In the Golden Square of Fattenport, travelers could still see the face of the heroic knight. The third one was the Master of Balia, the Duke of Golden Flames. His power in the mortal world was equal to his status in the dark world. He lived an extremely extravagant and decadent life, selfish and narrow-minded, and extremely greedy for beauty. He was cursed by passers-by as the Duke of Demons. The favored minister Victor was actually the lord of the tree herders Roger. He had challenged the majesty of the Holy Cathedral of Fire many times in public and preached heresy, and finally died on the stake. After his fall, his close ministers could not escape death. Victor Crollaire was still imprisoned in the Empire's most secure dungeons. As authority was stored in the underground holy cellar of the Ovchin Cathedral. It was sealed by the joint efforts of 4 saints, and a flame knight swore on his life to guard it for life. The so-called authority is actually the power of the Black Orb. The underground world was silent. The light beam hanging from above seemed to be the only source of light in the darkness. The flashing spots of light danced in the darkness, and a layer of floating fog was dense. Bai's voice echoed in the empty hall. A layer of sand fell from above from time to time, but no one cared. An explorer found this treasure in a labyrinth under the Fawn Grove and brought it out. The treasure then fell into the hands of a merchant named Rodrigo. He later murdered a high-ranking sorcerer of All for One, and the Black Orb fell into the hands of the sorcerer. The sorcerer then borrowed the power of the ancient evil, the Book of Mavecart. The power of the Black Orb was extracted and made into a skeletal scepter, a ring and a crown. These 3 treasures have the power to command the undead, and are the most precious treasures of the undead world. They were later obtained by the 3 people mentioned above. Among them, the skeletal crown has long been lost, and the amethyst ring was destroyed by the Holy Knight Luther. The skeletal scepter was sealed under the holy cellar of Ovchin. So it was the Black Orb. Brando suddenly understood. Like the ice orb, the Black Orb was a holy object of the dark element. It was the source of all negative magic, so it could command the undead that were infected by negative magic. However, the high-grade wizard of All for One was actually able to borrow the power of the ancient evil, the Book of Mavecart. The person who extracted the power from the Black Orb was obviously not an ordinary person. It was likely to be a famous figure in the history of this organization. You're here for this? To be exact, we came for the skeletal scepter. I killed the Flame family knight, and the skeletal scepter is now in the hands of Duke Ambuner. The commander of the White Legion? Bai nodded. Brando suddenly remembered something. By the way, did Amon turn himself into an undead have something to do with you? He asked. Amon can come into contact with the ancient evil, the Book of Mavecart, so he should be a genuine high-ranking member of All for One. However, the high-ranking members of All for One would never accept an undead. He should have been an undead after that. At this point, he couldn't help but take a deep look at Bai. Your tree herders can actually infiltrate All for One? All for One's method of infiltration was one of the best in the Amber Sword. An organization with such a strong infiltration ability would naturally have a strong anti-infiltration ability, and it might even be stronger, so it was hard for him not to be surprised. Infiltration? Not really, Bai replied very self-consciously. Bewitching Amon was just my personal action. That person wanted to pursue immortality, and I saw his ambition, so I was able to persuade him to join us. A cold smile appeared on her pale face. Immortality, only a lunatic can be immortal. A rational person would never chase after such an illusory thing. The Black Rose of Romantua was known to be immortal and eternal. To be able to hear such words from the mouth of a dark noble of Madara, Brando felt that it was somewhat interesting. I see, no wonder Andesha could recognize him. However, they didn't seem to be very close at the beginning. Amon didn't join tree herders? He has no interest in tree herders. That person is the kind of person who is truly selfish. Everything he does is for his own benefit, and he only lives for himself. He can't understand our pursuit at all, and we won't accept such a person. Bai said lightly. What about you? You bewitched him for the ancient evil, the Book of Mavakart, right? Yes, I used the secret of immortality to exchange with him, hoping to get the fake Book of Mavakart from him. Haku raised his eyelids and looked at him with his golden eyes. As far as I know, the high-grade magus from All for One used a fake copy of Mavekart's book as a medium to extract the power of the Black Orb. You seem to be very obsessed with the power of the Black Pearl, Brando asked doubtfully. Wait, you said that the high-grade magus from All for One used the fake Book of Mavakart as a medium to extract the power of the Black Pearl, and you want to get the fake Book of Mavakart from Amon. Could it be that you have already found the Black Pearl? You found it? The golden flames in Bai's eyes flickered slightly, but she did not answer the question. It seems like you guessed correctly, Brando. Not only did she find the Black Pearl, it is very likely to be in this place, in this hall. Allium Japonicum said with a faint smile. Bai suddenly turned her head and glared at the female knight, but she knew that it was useless. She could not help but sigh softly. Yes, I believe that I have found the Black Pearl. Brando and Allium Japonicum looked at each other, and saw the shock in each other's eyes. The Black Pearl disappeared without a trace after the high-grade magus from All for One. Even the 3 treasures that were created by extracting the power of the Black Pearl had been passed around for hundreds of years, and landed in the hands of 3 different people. The bone crown was nowhere to be found, and even the amethyst ring was completely destroyed. He did not expect this woman to be so ambitious. She did not even care for the 3 treasures and directly turned her attention to the Black Pearl. And from what she said, she had been planning for this for a long time. From what Brando knew, she had at least transmigrated earlier than him. This woman's schemes were too deep and calm. If they were not so familiar with her, she might not have suffered such a great loss. If I'm not wrong, the Black Orb should have been obtained by Lorison's wife, Haku continued. But at that time the power of the Black Orb somehow left the orb and was injected into her body, just like the blood of God. This can only be the work of tree herders. Your guesses that Glacé is a tree herder are similar to mine. I believe that one of the higher-ups of the tree shepherds extracted the energy from the Black Pearl and made it into pure God's blood. Lorison's wife is most likely a lower-middle believer of the tree shepherds. She's an oracle and an experimental subject. The blood of the dark god, Brando suddenly said. Bai looked at him and asked, You saw it from Andesha? Brando did not say that the blood of the dark god was with him, and he only nodded silently. Then it should be related to the Black Pearl, but it's not pure. It should be a secondary product derived from Glacé's experiment. There is only one true oracle of darkness in this world, and that is her. Bai scoffed. Her power is so pure and powerful. Otherwise, with the usual style of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, how could they seal her? I can only seal her up. Burning her at the stake is her only fate. Is this your true purpose for coming here? Brando looked at Lorison, who was standing at the side. The pale light shone on his white bones, and the golden flames in his eyes burned brightly. He did not respond to their words. He did not know if he could hear their conversation. This knight must have loved his wife deeply when he was alive. Otherwise, he would not have sacrificed his reputation and everything else. He did not even hesitate to endure endless pain after death to protect her. This was a true and noble love that surpassed life and death. It was above everything in this world. But beautiful things were often easily used by evil, just like what was happening now. Brando stared at the undead knight for a long time, then turned to Bai and asked, You intend to make a deal with him and take the power of the Black Pearl from his wife's body? Are you going to stop me? Shouldn't I stop you? Brando asked. Bai Lung sneered. But if I don't take the blood of the dark god, that poor woman's soul will be sealed here forever, enduring pain and suffering. And Sir John Lorison, a righteous and noble knight, will have to live in this dark underground in the form of the thing he hated most when he was alive. He will silently protect her all day, but he will never see his lover. The face of darkness, two pure souls forever bound here. Day after day, year after year. Only darkness lasts forever. What does this have to do with us? Mephistopheles was very confused. He could not understand the feelings of mortals. To him, there was only the difference between hunter and prey, master and servant. To him, other than food, there was only master. He dedicated all the beauty in his life to death and loyalty. Randolph only needed one look, and he would be willing to die. However, Brando and Allium Japonicum fell into silence. My lord, there are many powers in this world. As long as you give up your principles, they will be at your fingertips. For people like me, the power of the Black Pearl, the power of the Book of Mavacart, or any other power makes no difference. I will eventually obtain power and do evil to the world. It does not matter what method I use to obtain power. Right now, Sutra is the best result, so why stick to tradition? Moreover, only if I convince Lori-san, can you safely take the slate from here. This is a win-win deal. You can punish me at any time, can't you? Haku's voice echoed in the dark underground, like the whispers of the devil, full of charm. Since you know that I will kill you, why do you still pursue these? Brando asked coldly. Bai Luochu's eyes were burning with golden flames. She smiled, revealing her white sharp teeth. I don't believe in certainty. As long as there is a chance, it is worth it for me to use all my strength. If that's the case, why should I give you the chance to turn defeat into victory? Brando asked again. Unlike you, I am a cautious person. I want to control everything in my own hands. Haku did not speak, as if she believed that Brando would change his mind in the end. However, at this moment, a deep and old voice sounded in the dark. Let her come, young man. The three of them turned around at the same time. The golden fire in the tall and pale skeleton knight's eye sockets flickered. It turned around and looked at Haku. A hollow and vicissitude voice seemed to come from its chest. You said that you can lift the curse on Grace and free her from this endless suffering? This was not an undead without intelligence, Sir John Lori-san. Brando was the first to react. He quickly stopped Haku. This woman was too scary. Although she did not look like she was lying, who could guarantee that she was telling the truth? However, the skeleton knight only waved his hand and interrupted him. I have been listening for a long time. The three of you know my life very well. So, are you willing to sit down and listen to this old man's words? Brando and Allium Japonicum looked at each other in surprise. Haku did not answer. Her eyes flickered, and no one knew what she was thinking. In the end, Brando nodded and answered. Please go ahead. The undead knight was silent for a moment, and then its deep voice echoed in the darkness. I was born in the countryside of Granu. I've seen many people and many things in my life. I still remember some of those memories, but I can't remember some of them. But to me now, all that's left is endless pain and suffering. My love for Glacé is now only an oath and a bond. The feelings that belong to human beings are long gone. However, in the darkness, a thought often flashed in my mind. I want to see her again. Once this thought appeared in my mind, it took root and sprouted. I can't suppress it. I don't know if this is love, but I just want to see her again. Young man, I may have experienced more than you, but I don't dare to brag in front of you. I just want to ask you, can you fulfill the wish of an old man? I have dedicated my life to Martha, but I have never seen the light of day. The sigh in the dark was like the sand in the wind. After the sand and dust dispersed, only the endless vicissitudes of life was left. Brando and Allium Japonicum were speechless for a long time. I have dedicated my life to Martha, but I have never seen the light of day. But will they also end up like me one day? Is it true that one's efforts will be rewarded in this world? Or is it just a white lie? Is it just a whisper of comfort in the dark? What if there has never been light in this darkness? Then let me light this fire. Brando silently raised this irresistible thought in his mind. Bai was hiding in the shadows of the two people. She still didn't say a word, but Brando knew that she had succeeded. He sighed. There are some things in this world that you know are wrong, but you have to do it. Because the power called human nature shines in the darkness together with the light of reason. Maybe what we need is not coldly right, senpai. He whispered to Allium Japonicum. Allium Japonicum was silent. At that moment, she suddenly thought of the empire called Mardos. P.S. I recommend a new book, Return from the End of the World. From the end of the world until now, is it lucky or unlucky? 30 years later, the end of mankind will inevitably come. Is it to escape or to fight? The demons quietly infiltrate, and mankind stands on the edge of extinction without knowing it. The future warriors return, stirring up their souls, swearing to seize fate by the throat and save mankind from the abyss of destruction. In the depths of the soul, reality and fantasy intertwine, and the history changes. The young man stays true to his heart, sorting out a transparent path that leads to the future. Roten says, starting from me, the future is bound to be different. City plus end of the world plus infinity. It should be a little different from the other books. Previous book update record. This book started writing on August 21, 2013. The last update was on August 13, 2014. Period hiatus, 0 days. Hiatus rate 0%. Average daily updates 295 chapters. Trustworthy. Chapter 1014. It was the turn of summer and autumn. The ground of the Golden Needle Valley was covered with silver dust. Vulture tails and autumn leaves were everywhere in the forest. The sun shone through the forest like a golden curtain. However, under this beautiful and enchanting scenery, there were many distorted and unclean things. An army of white skeletons traversed through the forest. These pale skeletons seemed to have been dug out from the soil. Their movements were slow, and every step they took caused the rusty ring armor on their bodies to rustle. The black swords on their waists were returned to their scabbards. As their snow-white hip bones swayed back and forth, the swords constantly hit the metal buckles, producing a strange but uniform sound. These sounds gathered together like waves and waves, sweeping through the valley. As far as the eye could see, the place was densely packed with pitch-black flat-topped iron helmets and flickering phosphorescent flames. It was endless like a gray and white ocean. The seawater came from the east of the valley and gradually filled up the valley. It was pervasive and swallowed all living things. Wherever the seawater passed, the white bark of the shining silver trees would dry up. Even the leaves curled up and withered as if their vitality was being sucked out. A small group of human knights followed behind them. The knights were fully equipped with armor. They wore winged helmets and held long spears in their hands. The edges of their magnificent battle robes were like tassels that hung down close to the saddles of their ground dragons. These giant semi-dragons were also fully equipped. Not only were they wearing helmets with metal horns, they were also wearing thick cotton armor that would only be equipped during wartime. The cotton armor was 1 inch thick and was lined with a layer of metal rings and rivets. Its defensive power was even higher than normal armor. The outer surface of the armor was decorated beautifully. It hung down to the knees of the giant dragons and had a large white dragon head emblem on it. The relationship between the heavy cavalry and the undead army seemed to be very special. The reborn skeletons that covered the entire mountain seemed to treat them as nothing. The heavy cavalry did not seem to want to get too close to these creatures of distorted nature. The two kept their distance and each had their own path. On the other side of the valley, Yuta and her knight subordinates put down their war horses and hid in a depression in the ground. They stuck their heads out and saw the entire scene clearly. The female mercenary group leader's face was solemn, and her emerald green eyes were filled with a layer of cold light. It was not that she had never seen such a scene before. In Chablis and Tanajul, she had seen an undead army marching, covering the entire mountain range and covering the sun. She placed a hand on her warhorse's neck and gently stroked the elegant creature to calm it down. She turned to the others and asked, "Is that a knight of the White Legion? From the looks of it, he should be a white dragon knight." Mare replied. He had already lifted his helmet, revealing the face of a young man. Brando's White Lion guards were generally young. Compared to the old lion in the north, they were almost a new army. Yuta grabbed a handful of soil and rubbed it with her chainmail gloves. She put her hand to her nose, and a strong smell of grass and trees assailed her nostrils. This land was full of vitality, and it was definitely not contaminated by negative magic. These undead were not summoned from this place, but where did they come from? Most importantly, why were they here together with the Kurlutzian White Dragon Knights? Crew, you tell her. Aren't you a wizard? You've been learning from the Shire for so long, you should have improved a little. Yuta looked at another young man. The young man was wearing a cotton-padded armor that looked like a coat, but there were diamond-shaped protrusions on the surface of the armor. His collar was raised high, and he wore a thick felt hat. His face was red as he muttered helplessly, "I'm a wizard of the law, Lady Yuta. I've never learned black magic. If you want me to explain the principles of psychic magic to you, I can explain it to you. But what do you want me to say? I'm not a worm in the stomach of those cruise people. How would I know what they're doing here? But in my opinion, it's probably nothing good. If you dare to learn black magic, I'll be the first to kill you," Yuta replied. The young man was scared and shrank his neck. He looked over there as if he had thought of something. "But it's not like I didn't find anything. Those knight regiment behind them didn't look like they were monitoring the skeletons, but more like they were protecting someone," he muttered to himself. Come to think of it, the skeletons controlled by necromancy don't need to be monitored. They will naturally listen to the orders of their master. "You're saying that the person who's controlling these skeletons is among the knights?" Jana interrupted his long speech and focused on the main point. "Not necessarily. My lady, you know that in Madara's establishment, the necromancers are usually relied on to control the low-level undead without intelligence. A mid-level necromancer can only command a dozen skeleton warriors. So the undead army in Madara is not as endless as the rumors say. In fact, it is limited by the number of mid-level and high-level necromancers in the army. But their combat power is indeed very strong. First, the undead army is not affected by morale. Second, the necromancers can command the skeletons and zombies like they are their own arms. Their role is similar to the knight regiment in our human army, but they are better than us." "Get to the point," Yuta interrupted him again. "What I mean is, there are at least a few thousand undead army here. If they were in Madara, they would need at least a necromancer regiment to control them. The knight regiment doesn't seem to be able to protect so many people. Of course, there's also another possibility, and that's that someone used an undead treasure to control so many undead, or that there's a high-ranked undead lord among the knight that personally controls this army." The female knight waved her hand. "Why would a high-level undead lord need the protection of knights? Don't think that I've never seen an undead lord before. There must be an undead treasure inside. Where did these cruise people find such a thing? Is Her Majesty the Queen working with the undead?" The few young knights were cautious and did not say anything. Under the influence of Brando and the others, Yuta was used to not taking the cruise emperor seriously. She always called him by his name, but they did not dare to do so. The Woned Empire had lasted for thousands of years, and the majesty of the royal family had long been deeply ingrained in the people's hearts. Not to mention the royal family, even a noble lord was superior in their eyes. How could the emperor of the cruise people allow people like them to criticize him? Therefore, they could only turn a blind eye and turn a deaf ear to the female mercenary commander's nonsense. Yuta did not care. Her gaze passed through a few swaying dandelions and stared in the direction of the valley. Her eyes flashed a few times. "They don't look like they're going to Faust. This direction is going to the north. It's the same as the mountain people," Mare added. "Crew," she suddenly asked, "let me ask you something. If we kill our way in and take the undead treasure, do you think we can control this army?" The hollow suddenly became quiet. Yuta could not help but frown and turn her head to look at the few followers. "What's wrong with you? Are you mute?" The few young men were not mute, but they were shocked by her strange idea. "My lady, if you want me to be honest, I don't think this idea is very good." Crew's face was pale. "Let's not talk about whether we can control this undead army. Those white dragon knights are all gold-ranked masters. It's hard to say whether we can defeat them. Alright, this is actually a euphemism. I think we have no chance of winning at all." Yuta glared at him. "You're as timid as a mouse. Do you deserve to be called a knight?" "I'm a wizard," Crew replied, feeling wronged. "You're the best student of the Shires. But my teacher also said that as a wizard, the first thing to do on the battlefield is to protect yourself." "Enough, I don't want to hear your nonsense anymore." "Shut up." The young man shrunk his neck and did not say a word. As a top graduate of the Royal Knight Academy in Freya's first year, Mare seriously considered the feasibility of this plan. Although he was a mountain man, he was one of the few nobles born in the mountains. His father was a retainer under Duke Viro, so he was considered to have quite a high status. He was not the eldest son, So he was sent to the royal family to become a knight. But he still shook his head and replied, "It's too risky, my lady. Do you have other plans?" Yuta glanced over there. There's definitely something wrong with these undead. It's not normal for the cruise people to mix with the undead. As scouts, how can we just let them slip by under our eyes without doing anything? She waved her hand and interrupted the young knight's words. Don't worry, I'm not that reckless. When I was the leader of the mercenaries, you were still in the arms of wet nurses drinking milk. My lady, when you were the leader, I was your subordinate. Cruz said weakly. But the mercenary leader ignored him and continued. We can't, but we have reinforcements. She took out a light blue crystal. A rune was suspended in the middle of the crystal. The rune suddenly lit up and Yuta spoke to it in a low voice. My lord, I'm Yuta. My subordinates and I are now in the Golden Needle Valley. In the dark underground, a magic circle was gradually taking shape in a round hall. The center of the magic circle was surrounded by a pile of rubble. Sunlight shone through the holes in the dome and shrouded the magic circle. Brando silently watched Haku set up the magic circle not far away. He put down the crystal in his hand, and the light blue on the crystal gradually dimmed. It's a message from Yuta. He whispered to Allium Japonicum behind him. That woman didn't lie to us. Cruz's people have already made their move. She found an undead army in the Golden Needle Valley moving north. Allium Japonicum retracted her gaze from Haku's direction. Her dark eyes emitted a dim light in the dark environment. With her magic attainments, she could tell that Haku was setting up a typical magic circle, and it was related to psychic magic. She was not very worried that Haku would do something to the magic circle, so she stopped thinking and said, The mountain people and the undead army that disappeared a few weeks ago went to the border of Mihotofen. They want to trap us in Fathan. They should be waiting for Haku to make his move. As long as Fathan falls into eternal darkness, the undead army and the White Legion will attack. We have to speed up. Fortunately, Haku is still under our control. Brando could not help but feel lucky. If it were not for this coincidental encounter, and if Her Majesty the Queen's plan was suddenly activated, they might really be caught off guard. Yuta is in the Golden Needle Valley. It's not far from here. Are you thinking of stopping the undead army? Allium Japonicum asked sharply. Brando glanced at her and nodded. The undead army in front of them was very different from the undead army in Madara. The undead army in Madara was controlled by the Necromancer group. Although he was not afraid of a few thousand undead army, it was impossible for him to kill all of them. Even if the Necromancers lined up for him to kill, it would take him a long time to kill them, not to mention that they were hiding in the undead army that covered the mountains. However, the undead army in East Metz was controlled by a few people using undead treasures. This gave him a chance. When Yuta explained the situation over there, he was immediately tempted. Thinking of this, he raised his head and looked in the direction of Lorisen's undead soul. Although it was Haku who freed his wife, the soul of the knight should know who it should be grateful to. If Haku dared to do anything strange, it would definitely be the first to attack. Moreover, when it was alive, it hated evil. And it was at this time that Haku finally completed her magic circle. The Black Knight clapped her hands and looked at Brando with a meaningful gaze. I'm done. According to the agreement, I only want the blood of the Dark God. My lord, you can get the slate and more secrets about Constance in that person. If you don't mind, I'm ready to start. Brando looked at her and nodded. Sir John Lorry's son. Haku raised her voice and asked. Her voice was as hollow and hoarse as usual. The undead knight nodded. The golden flames in its eye sockets burned brightly. Haku slowly walked to the side of the magic circle. She used the swords of several knights of the dead moon to draw the magic circle on the ground. It was half an inch deep into the ground, forming a deep groove. It looked like a pact formed by two opposing moons overlapping each other. The curved lines intertwined with each other, forming a thick shadow under the light. Haku raised her wrist and was stunned for a moment before she remembered that she was already an undead. She frowned and looked at Allium Japonicum. Brando naturally knew what she meant. He grabbed his senior who was about to step forward and said, I'll do it. Thank you. Haku replied. Her voice was so calm that there was no trace of gratitude. Brando was not worried that Haku would plot against him at this stage. Haku's main class was the physical class. Although she was a silver elf who had been in contact with magic for a long time, she was far from Allium Japonicum who was well versed in magic. He pulled out Howran Gaia and made a cut on his hand. Bright red blood flowed out like the most beautiful wine. It flowed down the blade and formed a string of blood-red beads that dripped into the magic circle. Brando calculated that he had deducted about 21 HP. He then wrapped the wound with a thick cloth to stop the bleeding. When he removed the cloth, the wound had completely healed. There was only a shallow white mark left. Haku looked at him deeply when she saw this. She did not know if it was because of his strong self-healing ability, or because of his precise calculation of the amount of blood he donated. Brando did this to warn the woman that the magic circle required a ritual of blood sacrifice. The amount of blood needed for each circle was fixed. Whether it was more or less, the effect of the spell would be affected. The amount of blood needed for this magic circle was exactly 21 HP for a warrior. When Haku saw this, she naturally understood that Brendel knew the basics of her magic, and her heart skipped a beat. Oh! Chapter 10:15. Bright red blood seeped into the gray slate in the dark, and flowed along the indentations carved by the sword. The blood was not absorbed by the soil and dust. Instead, it seemed to be endowed with life. It was like a snake that coiled around a few powerful lines. The black magic circle was quickly filled with the red liquid. Haku's chanting became louder and louder. When she got up, a gray scroll flew out from her hand. It was suspended in midair by an invisible magic. The simple sheepskin slowly unfolded in the direction of the rolling wooden scroll until it reached the ground. The scroll was filled with ancient words and complicated patterns. Brando could not recognize the words, but he knew that it was a high-grade scroll. It was a high-grade magic circle ritual scroll. One of the characteristics of magic arrays was that they could be cast in advance. Most of the rituals and materials for the magic array could be prepared in the form of magic arrays. For example, almost 90% of the steps for this magic array had been prepared in advance in the ritual scroll. Bai only needed to complete the last step. Otherwise, with her ability, she would not be able to cast a high-grade magic circle on her own. The value of this ritual scroll was not lower than the awakening scroll. In addition, from what she said before, she should have another awakening scroll. Brando could not help but sigh at the depth of this woman's heritage. When the scroll flew out from Haku's hand, she let out a low cry and pointed a finger. An invisible ripple shot out from her fingertip and hit the pile of rubble in the middle of the hall. The rubble collapsed to the sides and revealed an altar. When Brando saw the altar, he suddenly understood why Lori-san did not let him get close to it. So it wasn't because of the war slate, but because his wife was sealed underneath. Seeing this scene, he couldn't help but curse his bad luck. The altar in front of him was made of marble and was carved into a hexagonal shape. Its cross-section was diagonally cut, and the surface was as smooth as a mirror. There were some sealing spells engraved on it. The gray altar seemed to have a long history. The surface was damaged and covered with scratches and dirt. The damage was old and new. Some looked like they were 8,000 or 9,000 years old. Some were caused by the falling vault, while others were unrecognizable. When the altar was revealed from the rubble, the whole hall resonated with Haku's chanting. Brando frowned. Allium Japonicum looked like it was nothing out of the ordinary. Andrique looked up. The vampire princess seemed to be able to see the invisible lines of law in the air. Her eyes were shining with silver light. Whoosh! After a moment, a blurry shadow suddenly appeared on the altar. Brando could vaguely see that it was a woman. She wore a black dress, and her face was covered with a layer of sadness. It looked like Lagus she was. At this moment, a book appeared out of thin air above Haku's head. The cover was pitch black, and the words were glowing. Brendel recognized the appearance of Mavecart's grimoire at a glance. It was obviously another copy of Mavecart's grimoire, and he was secretly shocked. Amon had already turned into ashes. His fake book of Mavacart had fallen into his hands. After absorbing the experience, it had already become a pile of trash. This woman had gotten another one from somewhere. Her ability was really shocking. Looking at this scene, he was even more afraid of Haku. She had the ability, the means, the wisdom, the prudence, and the patience. This woman had all of them, but she had to use them for evil. She was such a beautiful woman. As soon as the Book of Mavacart appeared, the atmosphere in the round hall changed. Other than Brando and Allium Japonicum, who were still indifferent, even Sir John Lorryson used his bony hand to grip the hilt of his sword. The Book of Mavacart was an ancient evil item. Even if it was a fake, the terrifying power it exuded was enough to make him, a saint, resist. Andrique and Mephistopheles looked solemn, ready to attack at any time. Hippamera held her scepter and stood behind Brando, secretly protecting her lord. However, Haku did not even look at them. She frowned. It was obvious that it was not easy for her to complete this step. The ultimate truth of everything, the ultimate form of all things. With the extremity, I will temporarily borrow your name and exercise your authority. She suddenly let out a low roar that did not sound like her voice. This low roar was majestic and cold, like rolling thunder. It echoed in the hall. Brando felt like he had heard this voice somewhere before. However, at this moment, the Book of Mavacart above Haku's head moved without wind. It flipped open and a few dark energy ribbons extended from it, entangling Laga's soul in the hall. Lorryson's soul saw this and let out a low roar, holding his sword with both hands and slashing towards Haku. Stop! Haku's voice returned to its hollow and hoarse state. She roared. If you don't want her to completely disappear. Lorryson was slightly stunned. In this moment, the dark energy ribbons had completely wrapped around Lagas, forming a black cocoon of light that floated in the air. Lorryson's soul stared at the cocoon of light, the flames in his eyes burning fiercely. He turned around and looked at Haku with a questioning gaze. Calm down, Haku replied. The undead knight hesitated for a moment, then put away his sword with a creak. However, he still guarded beside the cocoon of light. The atmosphere in the hall was a little strange. The war slate floated high in the air, suspended under the sunlight from the dome. Below the slate, a few people surrounded a huge cocoon of light. The cocoon of light shrunk and contracted as if it was nurturing life. However, no one spoke. Only Haku's incantation could be heard in the darkness. At this moment, Brando felt someone touch his hand from behind. She's activating the power of the Book of Mavacart. Bai Jia used her fingertips to write on his palm. Even though it was a long sentence, it was as if they had telepathy. Brendel understood her meaning immediately. She then wrote, "It's not just to extract the power of the dark orb. It's power." Haku's hand was cold, and her fingertips were soft and smooth. His heart skipped a beat, and he grabbed her hand and shook it lightly to show that he understood. Allium Japonicum did not remind him anymore and retracted her finger. Brando felt the touch on his hand disappear. For some reason he felt a sense of loss. But he was not surprised by Baijia's reminder. The Madara woman in front of him was not as simple as she seemed. She took a roundabout way to reach this point, and it was obvious that she had calculated meticulously. She would definitely not do useless things. Since she had done so much, then she must have a certain degree of confidence in her heart. If he was at this moment, if he felt that victory was in his hands, he would undoubtedly be digging his own grave. Therefore, even without Haku's reminder, he knew what he should do. Of course, Allium Japonicum's magic was far better than his. She could clearly tell what Haku was doing, but he could only guess what she might do based on his intuition and understanding of her. At this moment, a majestic force rose in the round hall. This force was emitted from the fake Book of Mavacart. Under everyone's gaze, an invisible force lifted Haku from the ground and suspended her in mid-air. Although half of the female undead knight's face was still exposed outside the broken mask, her golden eyes had recovered. She let out a long breath and pointed at Brando. Brando frowned slightly. He felt as if the blood in his body was burning, as if it would turn into steam at any time. However, it only lasted for a moment, and everything calmed down as if it was an illusion. Haku was slightly stunned, and her expression instantly turned ugly. I see. Brando naturally would not treat the abnormality in his body as an illusion. Blood-boiling spell. This was White's other power. He had heard that there was an evil druid that could control the power of life and water. The water here included blood. Blood was 75% water, and if one were to combine it with water, they would be able to control it. If the water in the body evaporated, the person would be no different from a dried corpse. This was a power that Haku had never displayed before. She was the lord of life and death, and the god of death Choka was named after her. Unfortunately, since he knew that his opponent was a tree herder, he would definitely be on guard against this. Tree herders were a branch of druids, so how could they only know necromancy spells? Moreover, this woman was well prepared. How could she forget to bring fresh blood for the sacrifice? Therefore, when she suggested using his blood for the sacrifice, he was already on guard against this. Allium Japonicum had obtained the silver bloodline of the Bugas in his previous life. Before she left, there was no more outstanding spellcaster than her, so it was too easy to guard against her magic tricks. Moreover, he had Andrique by his side. In terms of blood magic, she was a true master. Vampire. Haku finally recognized Andrique's identity, and also understood where she had overlooked. You're a human, but you're in cahoots with the undead. She scolded in exasperation. This made Brando feel very helpless. He thought that this woman was probably the one who had the least right to say this. She was the undead lord of Madara, but she was also in cahoots with humans. What right did she have to scold him? It was as if only the magistrate was allowed to set fires, but the commoners were not allowed to light lamps. However, he did not intend to waste his breath on this woman. He had expected her to go back on her words. He pulled out the Haurangaya that he had prepared earlier and shot toward Haku, who was in midair. At the same time, the undead Lord Lorisun finally reacted. Although he had to let Haku find a way to free his wife's soul, this did not mean that he would be biased toward this woman. In fact, from his standpoint, he admired Brando more. He knew that Brando had already made a huge concession by allowing Haku to obtain the blood of the Dark God. How could he tolerate this woman playing tricks in front of him? He was furious, let out a roar, and slashed his sword toward Haku, who was in midair. However, Haku had already understood that she would not have another chance if she failed. In fact, she was already very weak. She was relying on the power provided by the Book of Mavakart to support her to cast these spells. However, this power could not be maintained for long. She knew why the Book of Mavakart was called an eternal evil. It was different from Amon, who was addicted to power and could not help himself. Unlike the idiots, Haku was smart and rational. She immediately stopped after her attack failed. At the same time, she cut off the connection with the Book of Mavakart. A black hole expanded behind the female undead knight. She sighed and stared at Brando like a venomous snake. The next time we meet, it will be your death, human. Brando immediately understood that she wanted to use the power of the Book of Mavakart to open a portal and escape. However, he would not give her the chance. At this time, he had already made up his mind to kill this woman. His body flashed, and he used the power of Flash Strike Sword Art and Time Elemental powers. His body was continuously teleported in space, and in the blink of an eye, he was close to Haku. He was close to her. Bai Lung snorted, and a circle of black waves immediately appeared in front of her. However, Brando already knew that she was prepared. When his body hit the protective shield, it shattered like an illusion. 9 luminaries sword art. At this time, Haku had already understood what trick Brando was using. Her expression changed greatly, and when she looked back, she saw the latter. He had already appeared above the light cocoon, holding the sword with both hands and slashing down. No! Haku let out a roar. Brando had already guessed Haku's purpose. This woman had done so many things before for nothing more than the blood of the Dark God. Therefore, she would definitely not give up this thing easily. Otherwise, wouldn't it be useless? Therefore, he did not intend to attack Haku from the beginning, and Haku had indeed made up her mind to use herself as bait to attract his attention. Once he fell into these traps, although it would not be life-threatening, she could take advantage of this time to put away the blood of the Dark God and escape calmly. At this moment, Brando's sword slashed down and cut the energy belt in midair. Haku suddenly lost the connection with the blood of the Dark God and lost the opportunity to attack first. This meant that she had only 2 choices left. Either she gave up the blood of the Dark God and immediately left through the teleportation gate, or she gave up the opportunity to escape and stayed to snatch the blood of the Dark God. In Brando's heart, there was a glimmer of hope that this woman could stay. Otherwise, if she escaped, there would be endless trouble in the future. This time, he won because he was more familiar with this woman, and the other party's understanding of him was only superficial. Once she really regarded him as a troublesome enemy, then it would be his turn to feel it. It was troublesome. He did not want to live in danger all the time, not to mention that there were other people around him. This woman was unscrupulous and could attack the people around him at any time. However, Brando also knew that this hope was very slim. With Haku's character, she would definitely put self-preservation first. If she could not snatch the blood of the Dark God, she would have another chance in the future. However, if she did not leave, she might even lose her life here. He believed that this woman would not be unable to think clearly about which was more important. However, just as he thought so, he was surprised to see Haku stop the opening of the teleportation gate, turned around and rushed towards the light cocoon in the center of the hall. "You deserve to die, human." When Haku made this series of actions, she squeezed out these words from between her teeth. The golden flames in her eyes burned fiercely. It could be said that at this moment, she had truly fallen into a frenzy. Seeing this scene, Brando could not help but be stunned. There was only one thought in his mind: is this woman crazy? Oh. Chapter 10:16. Haku crashed into the light cocoon above the altar in the center of the round hall like a comet. The book of Mavakart above his head shone brightly, and his eyes were burning with anger. A black flame bloomed in the golden flame. Brando was slightly surprised. He knew that she had completely released the power of the ancient evils. He raised his sword solemnly. A giant black scythe appeared in Haku's hand and collided with the Howran Gaia. Sparks flew everywhere, and a black ripple spread out from the center of the two weapons. Wherever it passed, it was like a storm, leaving crisscross trenches on the solid ground. Mephistopheles' black dress was immediately torn apart, and the shards turned into butterflies that fluttered in the air, revealing the black soft armor underneath. Andrique's lace dress was also torn apart. Both of them had small cuts on their faces, and their long hair fluttered like wild grass. Hippamera raised the power of the mountains and rivers, and the arc-shaped earth shield enveloped her in Allium Japonicum. Under the black shockwave, every line of the law of the shield emitted a dazzling light, as if it would collapse at any time. With a crack, a circular crack appeared on the surrounding walls of the underground round hall. Brando and Haku exchanged swords 4 times in an instant, and each strike caused the underground hall to collapse a little more. When the 4th strike passed, a loud bang was heard, and a corner of the round hall suddenly collapsed, and countless gravel fell down. Hippamera's shield emitted a bright light, and then it shattered like countless scattered crystals. A thin black line spread from her left shoulder to the right side of her waist, and then a striking flower of blood burst out. The priestess screamed and flew back, and fell heavily into Allium Japonicum's arms. Hippamera! Allium Japonicum's expression changed, and he threw out an emerald with his right hand. The golden lines in the emerald shone, and then a crystal structure bloomed from within, forming a crystal shield. The ancient draconic magic was extremely powerful, so it was impossible to record it on ordinary scrolls. Other than special paper, only a stable crystal structure could be used to carry the bound lines of law. Once it was activated, the magic would be formed immediately. However, the black line swept across, and the crystal shield was cut into 2 halves. Senior's right sleeve instantly exploded, and a bloody line appeared on her fair arm. She gritted her teeth and groaned, quickly withdrawing her hand to protect the priestess in her arms, but blood was already gushing out. The warm sparkling liquid flowed like a stream onto Hippamera's face. "Senior, take her back to the cellar. All of you leave," Brando immediately ordered. He had previously fought with Haku 4 times, and every time he used his sword, he completely blocked the latter's attack. He had the upper hand in swordsmanship, but Haku's strength was too terrifying. He faintly felt that he could not hold his sword, and his right hand was starting to feel numb. Allium Japonicum knew that this level of battle was not something she could participate in. If she stayed, she would only restrict Brando's movements. She nodded at Brando, and decisively carried the unconscious Hippamera out of the hall. At this moment, the golden flames in Haku's eyes had been completely replaced by black flames, and half of her body was covered with a layer of black patterns. Her long hair fluttered without wind like rising flames. It was obvious that she had been completely eroded by the power of the Book of Mavakart. She was originally a supreme powerhouse, and her control of the power of the Book of Mavakart was far superior to that of the trash Amon. After completely absorbing the power of this ancient evil, her actual realm had faintly touched the edge of the sage realm. However, this power came with a price. Brando knew that Haku's body was already exhausted, and at this moment, she was completely burning her soul in exchange for the power of the evil. Once her soul was completely burned, she would forever lose her self-awareness and be controlled by the Book of Mavakart. She would become a lunatic like Amon. Brando could not understand. What did the blood of the dark god mean to this woman? How could it make such a calm person act like a lunatic? However, Haku did not seem to have the mood to talk nonsense. She coldly raised her scythe and slashed at him. Brando had no choice but to raise his sword to block. At the same time, he activated his innate talent, Frenzy. Although the power of the evil was short-lived, if he did not use all his strength, he would be killed on the spot before Haku's soul was completely burned. Although he had once killed Marietla, the Witch of Lies, who was also a supreme powerhouse, it was only through trickery. Marietla's line of witches could create terrifying realistic dreamscapes. In the dreamscapes they were like gods and their words were law. However, once the dreamscapes were destroyed, they were no different from mortals. They were even far inferior to the average elemental powerhouse. Although Marietla was full of confidence, she did not know that her archenemy, Ko Hua, had already seen through their weaknesses. Moreover, this generation of witches was far inferior to their ancestors during the Battle of Dusk. Hence, they had been plotted against by Ko Hua and died for no reason at Brando's hands. However, Haku was different. If one did not consider her schemes, she was a genuine supreme powerhouse. In a direct confrontation, she did not even need the Book of Mavakart to firmly suppress Brando. Moreover, with the support of this ancient evil, her current strength had even surpassed Mephisto's. Brando knew that if he did not use all his strength at the first opportunity, he would not have the chance to do so. When the swords clashed, the entire space produced a sharp noise that made one's teeth ache. It sounded like glass shattering, and bright cracks appeared in the flat space. The cracks extended in all directions, and the surrounding marble pillars shattered. On the north side of the hall, there was a statue of the sun god Perkin. Perkin was holding a flaming spear and was riding a sun horse and chariot. He raised his eyes and looked forward. Then, the head of the stone statue suddenly rolled off its body. The arm that was raised high was broken, and the body was torn apart into a pile of rubble. After the statue collapsed, an obvious crack appeared at the back of the hall. The underground round hall finally could not withstand the pressure and collapsed. First, cracks that looked like spider webs appeared on the dome. A large amount of gravel rolled down, and then large pieces of rocks fell. Finally, the entire dome collapsed and caved in. For ordinary people, this kind of underground collapse was tantamount to a disaster, but for the rest of the people in the hall, it was not a problem. Brando took a few steps back under Bai's attack. He was shocked to find that Bai's power was still increasing. Even with his frenzy talent, he could not withstand Bai's attack. He faintly felt a little stuffy in his chest. He was completely defeated in a head-on confrontation. This was the first time he had been defeated in the state of frenzy. Even when he faced Sabers, Korfa, and Milos in the Great Glacier, he had never been so embarrassed. Before Brando could stand firm, he saw an undetectable black line in front of him. It separated the falling gravel and came to him. The black line was near and far. It was the blade of Bai's giant scythe. The black line seemed to be able to attract all attention in the space. Brando actually saw the tough silver line begin to break under this attack. It caused the order in this small area to be distorted, forming a black hole that swallowed everything. This was definitely a power that surpassed the limits, and it did not belong to any known law. This was the power of dusk. There was no doubt that Bai had burned her two elements, so she obtained this power from the Book of Mavakart. It was no longer a law because it included the law itself. It was the truth of the universe, one of the powers of existence. It was only a flash of brilliance, but it was enough to dazzle everyone. Brando felt that all the questions in his previous life and this life had been answered at this moment. However, the price of this answer was death. This moment was unavoidable. My lord! Mephistopheles felt his hair stand on end at that moment. Without thinking, he spread out a pair of black membrane wings and shot towards Bai. The black sword in his hand burned with a raging fire, and the soul element condensed around him. He actually touched the power of the element manifestation in an instant. However, Bai only looked at the crossdresser coldly. A black light spread out from the Book of Mavakart. Before Mephistopheles could react, the black light had already swept across his lower body. The soul shield shattered after a moment. The crossdresser screamed and rolled down, covered in blood, and fell heavily to the ground. A black shadow landed beside him. It was the vampire princess, Andrea. There was a long streak of blood on Andrea's cheek. She looked up at Bai with hatred, but did not say anything. She picked up Morpheus, who was almost broken into pieces, and retreated. In the blink of an eye, she disappeared from the entrance of the underground round hall. In just a moment, the place where Andrique was standing was buried by the collapsed hall. The underground hall was now history. Brando threw away the Halran Gaia. At this level, swordsmanship was meaningless. Although his swordsmanship was close to the Tao, it was still too far away. This was the dialogue between the highest level elements. Only the elements could fight against the elements. Countless lines of law appeared around him at the same time. They intertwined with each other, weaving the most basic and primitive language of this world. Time and space had lost their meaning in this world. They were described as formulas, and these formulas were eternal. Energy and matter appeared at the two ends of the scale. They changed and transformed each other, and all laws and karma appeared. The past and the future seemed to overlap each other, and they could reach each other. These things that ordinary people could not understand were harmonious and unified in this world. They were one and the same. It was as if as long as one understood one of them, one would understand the mystery of the whole world. Brando saw a spreading energy. It appeared to be a dazzling black in this pure silver world. As this energy moved forward, the laws changed. Its disorder seemed to be increasing at every moment, affecting everything in the blink of an eye. But Brando immediately found the two strings of time and space. These two strings ran through the whole world, forming a perfect circle. When he touched these two strings, the energy he was in immediately spread out. It was as if it was everywhere in this world. Present and future, past and present. He could be at any point and he could be at any position. Brando used all his strength to avoid the dazzling black. The whole world seemed to resonate at that moment, but he soon found that his actions were in vain. All the laws began to collapse, and the countless possibilities he was in collapsed into one point. And he was at that final position. A black wave rushed towards him. There was no way to evade. But suddenly, a figure blocked in front of him. Brando narrowed his eyes and found that it was the tall body of the undead Lori Sun. It raised the huge sword, and with a loud bang, an irresistible force came through the body of the skeleton knight. Both of them flew back at the same time and fell heavily into the collapsed walls. Then they were buried by the sand, and the whole world fell into darkness. Brando coughed, and his thoughts paused for a moment. But he quickly recovered and shot out from the thick soil like a cannonball, landing on the ground again. He shook off the sand on his body and found that the battlefield outside had completely changed. The familiar underground hall was gone, and only a deep pit was left. The sunlight gathered from all directions, and he could not help but squint his eyes. The undead knight Lori-san stood at the corner of him. It was not in a better state than him. Its sword was half broken, its cloak was torn, and dust was everywhere. There was a deep wound on its chest, and several of its snow-white ribs were broken. The dancing soul fire was completely exposed. The two of them looked up at the sky at the same time. There, Haku's mind was almost completely controlled by the Book of Mavakart. She was bathed in endless black flames and turned into a flaming person, as if she would burn out at any time. The only thing left was her pair of incomparably determined eyes, as if there was an endless obsession supporting her, allowing her to fall into the abyss, but still retain a trace of clarity. Her eyes were fixed on the black cocoon of light in the air. She stretched out her hand, and the ribbon of light wrapped around the black cocoon of light flew to her, bringing with it a majestic power. This power made even Brando's heart palpitate. It was the power of the blood of the god of darkness. When the power of the Black Pearl was fully released, it was extremely shocking. However, although Brando and Lori-san wanted to seize it, they found that they could not move at all. The Book of Mavakart on Haku's head was emitting an endless pressure that far exceeded the limits of her control. Her burning soul was like a bright star that was moving towards the end of its life, ending everything in a burst of magnificent energy. In comparison, Amon, who used to control the projection of the ancient evil creature, was like a child waving a toy. This was the power of the divine. Brando felt his heart beating powerfully. Not far from him, Lorison's soul was roaring furiously, but it was useless. The blood of the god of darkness was rushing towards Haku, and Haku persisted in completing this sacred ritual. Whether she was about to die or completely controlled by the evil creature, it was as if it had nothing to do with her. To her, everything in front of her was the entire world. Brando tried his best to shift his gaze, and he finally noticed something out of place. It was a stone slab floating in the air. It was alone in that position, but it completely ignored all forms of energy around it. There's still one more chance. Brando gritted his teeth as he thought. He took a deep breath and shouted with all his strength, "Medisha!" In an instant, a door of light appeared on the battlefield. Chapter 10:17. Before Medisha appeared, a beam of silver light shot out from the light door and hit the war slate in the middle of the air with a crisp clang. It then turned to one side and shot into the ground. Only then did everyone see that the silver line was a silver shuttle-shaped spear, which was inserted into the collapsed stone wall at an angle. The war slate that was hit flew in the opposite direction and rolled in the sand beside Brando's feet. Brando chanted, "In the name of knowledge and wisdom, activate." The center of the war slate spun inwards and a beam of white light shot out from it and flowed into the patterns on the war slate. The entire war slate shone and then flew up again and stopped in front of Brando. "Get out of my way." But it was at this moment that Haku roared. A black belt of light swept across and hit the war slate, sending it flying like a cannonball to the ground. It then bounced up high and flew in the direction of the forest in the distance. However, the majestic power of dusk from the Book of Mavakart activated the war slate's defense system in an instant. As the war slate spun in the air, countless pure white light beams shot out from the patterns. The light beams directly pierced through the overlapping black belt of light. One beam pierced through Haku's waist and the other pierced through her chest. Haku screamed and fell straight to the ground. Her body was covered in black flames as if she was going to be burned to ashes in an instant. The remaining light beams shot into the air, the ground, and the direction of the forest. Everywhere they passed, it was like a beehive. Once the light beams hit the trees, they immediately burst into flames and turned into white ashes in the blink of an eye. The war slate that had lost its light rolled into the forest not far away. Less than 5 meters away from where it landed, a rock was suddenly lifted from below. Allium Japonicum carried Hippamera, who was covered in blood, out of the secret passage. She could smell the burning smell of the battlefield outside and could not help but frown. But just as she raised her head, a bright light reflected in her eyes. Bookshelf number: Arcane 10522031V, Armor, Initials D, Implantation Technology, Inheritance of War Equipment. Inheritor: Iron Bloodline Match. Inheritance begins. From Earth Legion. At the moment when the white light disappeared, Brando and the undead knight Lori-san immediately felt the pressure on them loosen. It's done now. Brando did not have time to retrieve his Halran Gaia. He directly activated his elemental power and flashed in the direction where Haku fell. Lori-san was a little slower, but he followed closely behind him. The two of them arrived at the edge of the deep pit where Haku fell, but found no one there. Brando's heart skipped a beat. A claw burning with black flames had already reached out from the side. Without thinking, he raised his fist to block it. With a muffled bang, Brando only felt a piercing pain from his arm. Haku was not going to let Brando go. She threw punch after punch. In an instant, she and Brando had exchanged 30 to 40 blows. In terms of swordsmanship, Brando was far superior to this woman. However, when it came to close combat, he was too far behind. Not to mention that Haku had now mastered the power of the Book of Mavakart. After 30 to 40 punches, Brando only felt his arms go numb. It was as if he could no longer feel his arms. At this time, he caught a glimpse of a black light sweeping towards him from the corner of his eye, but there was no way he could dodge it. Medisha, who was dressed in silver, stepped out of the portal. However, she immediately felt darkness in front of her. A black shadow had flown back from the front and crashed into her. She groaned and immediately felt that the person in her arms was her lord. At the same time, the light door behind her shattered and disappeared. She hurriedly hugged Brando with one hand and took a step back. At the same time she raised her right hand. The silver spear that was stabbed into the ground not far away instantly turned into thousands of light particles and disappeared. It then reappeared in her hand. 1,000 army strike. Medisha threw the spear forward with all her might. A silver line flew across half of the battlefield and shot towards Haku. Haku turned around and glanced coldly. A series of black ribbons of light rose from the ground and weaved together to form an arc-shaped light shield. The spear hit the light shield hard and only created a trail of golden sparks. On the other hand, the spot where the spear hit the light shield reflected a ray of black light at 10 times the speed. Medisha did not even have time to react before her chest was pierced. She widened her eyes in disbelief and spat out a mouthful of blood. Brando woke up from his temporary coma. He felt that it was raining on his forehead. He subconsciously reached out and wiped his forehead. The thick smell of blood made him realize that something was wrong. He suddenly woke up and remembered that he was still on the battlefield. He opened his eyes and saw Medisha's pale and weak face. The elven princess's mouth was full of blood, and there were layers of black circles around her eyes. She covered him with her hands as if she wanted to smile at him, but the pain twisted her smile into an expression that was uglier than crying. Medisha! Brando felt that his heart was about to stop beating. He looked down and saw the black hole on her chest. Her silver robe was stained red and it was a ghastly sight. His mind almost went blank for a moment. Medisha and the Shire no longer had the ability to be resurrected from the graveyard after becoming planeswalkers. If she died here, then the pure and kind Silver Elf Princess would truly disappear from this world. I'm fine, my lord. Medisha seemed to read the deep fear in Brando's eyes. She felt a little warm in her heart. She touched his face with her hand and answered with some difficulty. Brando immediately opened Medisha's status menu and found that the elven princess still had a little bit of HP left. This discovery made him feel a little relieved, but at the same time, a deep sense of uneasiness and fear surged in his heart. He got up and glanced at the battlefield. He happened to see Sir John Lorison being sent flying by the dark ribbons. Its golden polar plane was completely penetrated by the power of the Book of Mavacart. One of the ribbons swept away its left arm, while another broke its waist into two. Then, Hale controlled the dark ribbons to wrap around its neck, and lifted the skeleton knight into the air like a dead dog, forcing it to face the direction of his wife's soul. I'll let you see how your wife dies, noble knight. Bai Lung laughed. At this moment, she was completely wrapped in black flames. Even the lower half of her body had disappeared. Her original appearance could no longer be seen. But when she heard this voice, Medisha recognized it in an instant. It's you. Medisha cried out. The unforgettable battle in Abi's castle reappeared in front of her eyes. Medisha's voice was not loud, but Hale still heard her words. She coldly turned around and faced her direction, her hollow voice echoing in the air. You still haven't improved, Medisha. If my attack was just a little bit more off, it would have pierced through your soul fire and completely turned you into a lifeless corpse. 1,000 years have passed, and you still have to rely on my pity and pity to live. Don't you have any thoughts about this? Hearing this, Medisha's expression changed drastically. Brando had never seen such fear and uneasiness in her silver eyes. She stared at the woman in the sky who was engulfed in flames. Who are you? Let me tell you, Medisha. There are some things in this world that only those with power and status deserve to talk about and possess. You can't rely on charity. Kindness, what kind of rubbish is kindness? People show mercy to kittens and puppies only because it shows that one of them has absolute dominance. The so-called mercy is the leftovers left behind by excess power. If you can't understand this, then you can only linger in sorrow and failure forever. Royal sister? Hale fell silent and no longer spoke. She turned around and kept the black belt in her hand. The thing in the black light cocoon finally broke out of the cocoon. A translucent woman in a long dress floated in the air with her eyes closed. There was a black ball of light floating on her forehead. Brando did not need any description to recognize what it was. The Black Pearl. When Hale saw the ball of light, The flames in her eyes became brighter. She immediately reached out to grab it, but Brando would not let her do as she wished. The power of the Book of Mavacart continued to weaken. The woman was just an arrow at the end of its flight. As long as she could hold on for a while longer, the outcome of the battle would still be uncertain. He patted Medicia's shoulder and said gently, "Stay away, Medicia." After that, his body flashed and appeared in front of Hale. "My lord." The silver elf princess's knees went soft and she knelt on the ground as if she was a puppet. Hale had only stretched out her hand halfway when she saw Brando reappearing in front of her. Her eyes were filled with anger. "You're courting death, human." Brando did not say a word. The anger in his eyes was not inferior to Hale's. If it was said that the battle before was a battle of interests, but at this moment, it was destined that only one of them could survive. As soon as he appeared, he attacked with all his might. He activated Charge and the Crown of Thorns. He completely abandoned his defense and his attack was boosted to the limit. He turned into a meteor and crashed into Hale, who was in midair. Hale did not intend to talk too much nonsense with Brando. She knew that she did not have much time left. She coldly glanced at Brando. Dozens of black energy beams rose from behind her and shot toward Brando. At this moment, she did not even care about the undead Knight Lori's son. She was not afraid of a mere elemental truth human. There was only one thing left in her eyes, the blood of the dark god. But she soon realized a problem. Countless black light beams instantly pierced through Brando's body. His clothes and armor were completely torn apart. Even the behemoth's grip was shattered inch by inch under the powerful power of the Sage Domain. Fragments of his bones, organs, and blood flew all over the sky along with the energy beams, turning him into a bloody man in an instant. But no matter how dense and terrifying the attacks were, he continued to move forward without dodging. He was like the god of war described in the legends who had the strength to fight against 10,000 soldiers. When he moved forward, the gods and ghosts would avoid him. A bloody path was naturally formed. Brando covered his heart with one hand. His long hair danced like wild grass. He raised his head. His bloodied face was like a ferocious ghost, but he was smiling. His snow-white teeth gleamed with a cold light. Unyielding. At this moment, Hale realized that she could not stop all of this. Golden bloodline, perfect body. A thought that made her extremely terrified arose in her heart. Brando had already grabbed her wrist. Hale actually forgot to react for a moment. Then a fist became bigger and bigger in her vision. Bang! Hale screamed. She was almost sent flying by Brando's punch. But she could not fly away because one of her hands was still tightly clamped by him. She finally caught her breath with great difficulty. Brando's second punch was already in front of her. This time, Hale finally remembered what she should do. She screamed and threw a punch at Brando. Brando did not dodge. The two fists collided heavily. With a loud bang, Brando's right hand suddenly became completely distorted and fell limply to the ground. However, Brando's attack power with the Crown of Thorns fully activated was not to be underestimated. Hale screamed as well. Her right hand made a series of crisp cracking sounds, and then she could no longer raise it. No matter what, Hale was still a woman. This time she was in so much pain that she almost fainted. She could not help but gasp. But what she did not expect was that the damned human actually used his remaining hand to hug her tightly, and pushed her away from the Book of Mavacart. "You deserve to die." Hale immediately realized what he wanted to do. She endured the pain and extended the last few light ribbons. They wrapped around the blood of the dark god in midair, and threw it in her direction. At the next moment, the Book of Mavacart in midair finally lost its last bit of power. It flickered twice and disappeared into the air. At this time, the two of them were completely powerless. They hugged each other and fell to the ground like meteors. Hale's soul had already begun to dissipate, leaving only the burning obsession in her eyes. She stared at the black ball of light that followed closely behind. She knew that there was only one step left in her ritual. Once she obtained the blood of the dark god, she still had hope of turning the tables. However, under her horrified gaze, she saw the black ball of light enter Brendel's body without hesitation, like a river returning to the sea. She could even feel the excitement and joy coming from the blood of the dark god. My ritual. Hale seemed to have seen the most impossible ending. You have the blood of the dark god in your body? Brando was already unconscious. Chapter 10:19. The bell of dusk rang in the sky above Nibosia city. The sound of the bell echoed in the empty twilight. Near and far, the setting sun shone through the fiery glow of the sunset onto the dome of the golden palace, reflecting an orange-red glow. Teams of golden-armored Praetorian guards lined up on the slope outside the palace walls to change shifts. From afar, the uniform commands of the ceremonial knight could be heard. The noise passed through the copper-plated treetops and even into the inner court. In the winter solstice palace, Pope Pétion III hurriedly finished his dinner. Half a carefully cooked roasted lamb, a silver sea crab, and exquisite pastries were all served on a snow-white porcelain plate. The meat dishes were made with basil leaves and snow tree leaves from Saint-Ossol. The surface was covered with sauce and black pepper. The meat was tender and fragrant, but the diner himself had no appetite. After tasting it, he put down the silver knife and fork and wiped his mouth with a square handkerchief embroidered with golden silk. Only then did he order the attendants to arrange a carriage for him to go to the Emerald Hall. Fanzin's religious authority was unified. Although the nobles would still have grudges against the Holy Cathedral because of the unequal distribution of benefits, from the secular power upwards, the secular laurels and the Holy Scepter were all in the hands of one person. Because of this, the election of the Pope was often not hereditary. Usually it was chosen from the 8 cardinals. After the abdication of the previous Pope, he took the title of saint and lived in the Emerald Hall. He did not ask for secular power, but he was still the spiritual leader of the Holy Church. Therefore, for thousands of years this empty position also had great power. Today, although the current Pope could make arbitrary decisions, he was still subject to the restrictions of the Pope. These days, Pétion III's uneasiness stemmed from this. He sat in the carriage and looked at the shadow of the Emerald Hall from afar. It was like a giant beast entrenched in his heart, eyeing him covetously, making him uneasy. The former Pope, Assabantus XI, was his mentor on the Holy Road. He had trained him to where he was today. Although the teacher-student relationship was harmonious, they were always separated by a throne. Pétion knew that this was due to their respective positions. All the previous popes were like this, and it was understandable. He had always advocated a holy war against Cruz in the south. Assabanto XI had always known his thoughts. Now that the people of Cruz were in chaos without a fight, and that crazy queen dared to restore the dark reign, this was a heaven-sent opportunity for him to fight against Cruz. He had even contacted the Wind Elves and the envoys of the Grecius Knight Order, and had stockpiled troops and provisions at the border, preparing for a grand plan to leave a mark in history. But at this time an edict of ceasefire had dashed his hopes. This edict came from the emerald gold sacred hall in front of him. This kind of thing might not happen even once in 100 years. The last time it happened was during the time of the Rimador Rebellion, when Gloria I used the power of the Holy Knight Order to remove the reigning pope from his position. This association made Pétion III's face gloomy. He looked gloomily at the 7-foot-high golden palace gate of the Emerald Sacred Hall that was slowly opened by the guards on both sides. No one knew what kind of thoughts were running through his mind. The deeper uneasiness in his heart came from the reactions of the bishops. The bishops and the Knight Order did not seem to react as fiercely as he had expected. The interior of the empire was as calm as a mirror, without the slightest ripple. He knew that the old man behind the palace gate must have used some unknown power to make all parties submit to him respectfully. As a superior, he could not tolerate power that was not in his grasp, especially when this power was so great that it was beyond his expectations. Accompanied by his attendants, Pétion III walked through the corridor and stopped in front of a dark walnut door. He then raised his hand to dismiss his attendants, and at the same time, stopped his servants from announcing his arrival. Facing this walnut door, the supreme ruler of the Holy Inquisition found a trace of hesitation in his heart. But this trace of hesitation was as light and weak as a spider's web. His Holiness the Pope broke free with a light struggle, put his slender palm on the doorknob, and pushed the door open. Since old age, Assabanto XI liked to light the fireplace in his study, sit on a low chair, and read the scriptures and documents of the church all day long. Although Pétion III doubted how much true meaning there was in it, he was more or less envious. Since he had taken control of the secular power, he inevitably alienated the divine will. The Holy See is inferior to the ascetics. This proverb was not a rumor in Fanzin. A warm breath hit his face, and the hot wind hit his cheeks. He could not help but squint his eyes. The flickering fire in the fireplace seemed to flow through the gap of the door. It was like a flowing warmth, flowing over his golden shoes and the end of his holy robe. Asabanto 11 was not alone in the room. In addition to a servant in his 40s, there was also an old man with white hair and a white beard and glasses. Petyen III recognized this man at a glance. He was a famous scripture scholar in the holy sanctum. Asabanto 11 was still wearing a plain robe today, but he wore a hat, which was rare. He looked quite formal and serious. Sitting opposite him was a woman. Petyen III was a little surprised and could not help but take another look at the woman. But after another look, he could not take his eyes off her. The woman had long dry brown hair and a pair of eyes that shone like jade embedded in a mountain rock. The reason it was called embedded in a mountain rock was because her skin looked extremely dry and dull. Her cheekbones were high like steep rocks. Her lips were sharp and angular, as if they were carved out of them. It was obvious at a glance that this woman had an extremely firm character. There was only one woman in the world who had such a face, and only one woman who had a lifespan of 1,000 years. Petyen respectfully greeted, "Your Excellency." Asabanto 11 looked at his student with a smile as he closed the book in his hand. It was a scripture that described the early teachings of the holy sanctum. The person who recorded it was buried under the soil about 300 or 400 years ago, although he was posthumously canonized as a saint after his death. He waved his hand, indicating that Petyen did not need to be so courteous. It was as if he had already foreseen that the Pope would come. "Your Excellency, are you here today because you have a lot of questions?" The situation was out of Petyen's control. The current Pope pondered for a moment and nodded solemnly. "Let me answer you," Iranta the sage said. Her voice was unexpectedly soft and pleasant, completely unlike her face. "I asked His Excellency Asabanto to issue that edict." "Why?" Petyen III asked. "Because I hope that Fanzin will not participate in this war, Your Excellency." "Why?" Petyen still asked the same question. Asabanto 11 continued with a smile. "Your Excellency, for half a century, the holy sanctum has been in turmoil, and the old and new doctrines have been in dispute. You have seen all of this with your own eyes. The reason for this is nothing more than to discuss the issue of justice. The root of this problem is the Great War 60 years ago. We saw many things behind the scenes of that war, so much so that we began to question the foundation of our existence. What do you think of this?" Petyen did not answer. Instead, he glanced at Iranta. "I can't give you an answer to who is right and who is wrong in history, Your Excellency," Iranta calmly replied. "Although I have experienced it myself, I, Gil, Saint Tassol, and your predecessor Fanzin can't answer this question. Odin believes that he is wrong, but this only represents his own opinion. He can't judge history and everything in the past. In a certain period of history we are in, no one can judge himself correctly, not to mention there were countless sages before him. Many people were involved in it. Anyone in this part of history, whether it is a person who experienced it or a bystander, can only observe a fragment of it, so we can only experience it ourselves and witness it. I have lived for 1,000 years just to see the result with my own eyes." Petyen III frowned. "But do you think that the Queen of the Cruz people has made the right choice?" Iranta shook her head. "No, it is because we can't be sure whether we are right or wrong that I want to see another path in history. You know the prophecy. The lost moon takes away the light is lost, the silver generation is lost to the earth, walking forward in the darkness and obscurity, the chance encounter between the emperor and the fool, the rusty clockwork is being restored, the sword that changes fate, wound is waiting for this sword that changes fate." "Do you believe in the dark prophecy, sage?" Petyen III asked. "Everything will be born from the darkness. This is what the Myrna people are unwilling to give up, Your Excellency," the sage replied. "This is the age of black iron, the age of heroes. Martha gave power to the mortals, believing that heroes will be born from the mortals. But in the eyes of the gold and silver race, how can the weak save our world? What's more, there is the failed work of being lost in the dark forest. Everything seems to be a warning to civilization that this is a wrong path. The descendants of the Azure Knight quarreled endlessly over this, and the fire of civilization declined day by day, to the point that it could not continue. The Dark Dragon Odin made a last resort choice to save all of this, and today will be the time for it to show the results. Aranta looked at Petyan III and replied, "The millennium of history seems to have returned to a cycle, but this may not be the beginning and starting point of everything. I will observe the agreement with Odin to witness the end, but in any case, I still hope to preserve a little fire for civilization, and not pour all of our power into just one answer. Therefore, I hope that the people of Fanzan can leave this mortal stage, because there is a more important war that needs your strength." Petyan III raised his head slightly. "Sage, what do you mean?" Aranta raised her head, and her emerald eyes seemed to be able to penetrate the palace walls of the Emerald Hall. In the direction she looked across the vast hills and plains, under the fiery clouds, the waves of the Emerald Sea tirelessly washed the towering white cliffs for thousands of years. On this vast land, the alliance known as the 10 Cities took root and multiplied. About 530 years ago, mercenaries and merchants from the Anir and Makesun regions came here and spent 100 years to build the first city here. After half a century, a new kingdom was established. Its people were humans, mountain people, elves, and dwarves. The teachings of the Templar were widely spread here, but the faith of nature was not rejected by the people. This was a paradise of freedom, where money and the sound of swords echoed each other all year round. But today, under the White City, the fishermen who went out to sea suddenly stopped their work. Some of the sailors were cleaning the nets and ropes, some were still climbing on the masts, some were drunk and had just walked out of the cabin onto the deck, some were raising the sails, and some were raising the anchor by the capstan. But all of them stopped and looked back in the direction of the sea and the sky. The turrets on the city wall were firing warning shots, and groups of guards swarmed onto the city wall. The sea was blue, and the intersection between the sea and the sky was calm, as if nothing unusual had happened. But in the blink of an eye, dense black dots appeared in that direction. Rand hastily put on a suit of armor and hurried to the top of the city wall. His squires escorted him to the edge of the battlements. He raised his hand to stop the noise around him, and then raised the monocular in his hand. What he saw was a white triangular sail, and it almost blinded his eyes. He cursed under his breath and looked down. The silver oak emblem on the sail shone in the sun, and then he saw the elegant white hull of the elves. "The fleet of the wild elves," Rand sighed and put down the monocular. "There are at least 300 ships, and this is an army of 30,000 people. Is Eloranta crazy?" The Eloranta he mentioned was naturally referring to the kingdom of the wild elves. He took another look to be sure that he was not hallucinating. At this time, the alarm bells in the White City were already ringing, and the ships outside began to file into the harbor. Rand glanced at the harbor and estimated that the harbor would be closed in about half an hour. He looked back. He was just a small captain, and he could not make any decisions on this matter. He handed the monocular to his deputy, and then said to a squire, "Go and inform the faraway eagle and the city lord, and let them decide. If the elves are serious, White City will not be able to hold. We must immediately seek support from other cities." The retainer glanced at him in panic before trembling as he took the brass token and stumbled down the stairs. "Look at that ship." Suddenly, a squire pointed in the direction of the sea and shouted. Rand looked back and saw a light boat coming out of the Wild Elves' fleet and approaching White City at an extremely fast speed. "It's a messenger. They sent a messenger. What do the elves want? P.S. A new month has begun. Everyone, keep up the good work." Chapter 1020. Brendel felt as if he had just experienced a long dream. The dream was made up of countless fragmented images. The images flashed before his eyes one by one, like a silent river. As time passed, he experienced one world after another in a trance. In the first world, he was half awake and half asleep. There were many tall and handsome humans standing in the room. They had black hair and golden eyes. They were wearing robes. The robes were red on the left and black on the right. There was a dark golden collar at the neckline. There was an Ouroboros on the robes. There were 11 of them in total. One of them stepped forward and reached out to touch his eyelids. The ring of coiled serpent on his index finger was shining with silver light. The first thing he saw was the dark walls and floor, which were covered with a lattice network used to transmit magic power. It looked like the upper level of a tower. Outside the round hall were 12 black stone pillars. Outside the pillars were a sea of golden clouds. Towering buildings stood in the middle of the sea of clouds. In the distance, the Perkin sun emitted an eternal afterglow on the horizon. Those handsome humans were talking to each other, but they did not make any sound. It was like a silent movie. Occasionally, they would draw a bright symbol in the air, and then the others would nod as if they agreed. From the mouths of these people, Brando finally distinguished a word that he could understand in modern Crew's language. The Truth Society. The picture quickly became fragmented and dimmed. In the second world, Brando felt that he had become an exiled refugee. The beautiful buildings around him were no longer there. He was in a daze following an unknown clan. Giant beasts were pulling wooden carts on the Great Plains. Looking back, the sky was still covered with golden clouds. He could vaguely see the shadow of a tall tower on the clouds. And above the sky, countless meteorites were falling from the sky, dragging long flames behind them. They hit the ground obliquely, leaving a flash on the horizon. But there was only one image that left a deep impression on him. A huge dragon shrouded half the sky, spreading its wings from the south of the Great Plains all the way to the north, crossing the horizon. Its curved neck was like a huge tower on top of the clouds. Its huge head stared at the ground, its golden eyes shining. It was like a huge shadow in the clouds, dominating the entire sky and earth. However, a ray of emerald green light was rising from behind the clouds. It was like a star, shining brightly in the sky, pointing directly at the dragon's heart. Then the second image disappeared like sand in the wind. Then came the third world, which was made up of a series of broken images. Sometimes he felt that he was being carried by a group of people in black robes through mountains covered by dark clouds. Sometimes, he felt that he was worshipping an altar towering under the golden sun with countless believers. On the altar stood a giant surrounded by lightning. Then, he saw a human in a red robe injecting a flaming bead into the body of a monster. The monster's wail shook the heavens and the earth. He saw countless such monsters being created. Most of them were killed immediately, but a small number of them escaped into the forest and became monsters. The ones that survived were some black-haired, golden-eyed creatures that resembled humans. Then the image dimmed again. At that moment, Brando suddenly understood that this was the process of the birth of the Myrnas. Some people were trying to use the blood of God to recreate the divine people, and they were the derivatives of this experiment. After understanding this, his mind fell into a deep sleep. This sleep seemed to have taken a century. When Brando woke up again, he had not opened his eyes, but he had already smelled the faint fragrance of flowers in the wind. When he opened his eyes, he was already in an exquisite courtyard. The courtyard was like a dream with evergreen spring, nightingales singing softly, and ivory-white carved pillars hidden in the shade of the trees. Elven guards with silver halberds in their hands stood at the left and right. Surrounded by the crowd, a silver-haired elven girl lifted her skirt and came to his side. She bowed to him and said, "Good afternoon, royal sister." Brando was stunned for a moment, and these images dissipated like sand in the wind. Then he heard an angry voice. "How dare you pry into my memory?" This sentence was like tearing a hole in the entire dream, causing the world of the dream to be completely fragmented, and it woke Brando up abruptly. He opened his eyes. The first thing that came into his sight was a verdant green, with fragmented golden light floating slightly in the green field. When he saw it a little more clearly, Brando found that it was the shade of a tree that swayed slightly in the afternoon. Then came into view was a short-haired woman with a cold expression. She was holding her hand on his forehead, slightly frowning, and her short platinum hair was shining under the sun. Seeing that Brando had woken up, the woman's furrowed brows relaxed, and the tip of her eyebrows even raised a little. This subtle movement made Brando realize that the other party knew him. "You saved me." Brando groaned. Just as he was about to move, he felt an endless pain coming from his limbs and bones. He remembered everything that had happened before. He remembered the fierce battle with White. He remembered that he was seriously injured in the state of unyielding, and the blood of the dark god rampaged through his body and caused further damage. It could only be said to be a miracle that he was still alive. But there were no miracles in this world. so the only possibility was the woman in front of him. After a brief confusion, he had actually recognized the identity of the other party. The Holy Maiden of the Lion Palace, Sydney. But why was she in this place? Sydney silently pressed her hand on Brando and said, "Your injuries are too serious. The holy water can only barely pull you back from the hands of the Grim Reaper, and there is no way to heal your external injuries." Only then did Brando understand his current state. He silently lay down for a moment, his mind in a mess. It took him a while to sort out his thoughts, so he sat up from the ground with some difficulty and took out the holy water from the dimensional space to drink. Feeling that the injuries in his body were gradually recovering under the infusion of the holy energy, Brando had time to weakly open his character attribute panel. Then he was stunned by his current state. Under the character status column, the line of absolute strength clearly wrote, Elemental Enlightenment, Peak. He immediately felt his own strength. Under the stability of his elemental power, there were hidden turbulent waves, but the lines of law that made up his elemental power were more stable and unbreakable than before. The two laws related to time and space appeared clearly around his body, and there was no longer a feeling of obscurity like before. This was an important characteristic of the elemental enlightenment stage. From the realm of elemental enlightenment to the realm of elemental enlightenment, it was the process of mastering and understanding power. The higher the realm of elemental enlightenment, the deeper and clearer the understanding of one's own elemental power. When one reached the peak of elemental enlightenment, the elemental power of an elemental master was no longer just a passive law. At this stage, the elemental power did not have only a few active and passive skills. Players could truly rely on their own will to manipulate and understand the elemental power, and the power of the elemental power, other than the limitations of its own nature, was only dependent on the level of understanding and control of the elemental power. In fact, this was already the threshold to the peak of elemental power, and also the foundation of ultimate power. After going through this stage, players could truly grasp the power of the elemental power. Brando looked down and saw that in addition to the original active and passive skills, there was an additional active effect. Players will be able to freely manipulate the power of time and space. Of course, this way of displaying the power of the elemental power was the same as the active skills of the elemental power. It required a continuous consumption of order power, which was the so-called degree of control and control of the elemental power. The consumption was very shocking, but the shocking consumption also brought about powerful effects. Just like before, the active and passive effects of the elemental power that Brando could use were only limited to teleportation, limited manipulation of the flow of time, and increasing his own defense. So when Whitehair attacked, he could only rely on teleportation to escape, and was easily suppressed by his opponent. But now it was different. Brando could now easily be immune to all damage. He only needed to isolate either space or time, and as long as the psionic elemental power or the power of dusk could not negate this condition, then limited invincibility would be established. And this was the reason why the elemental power, which was similar to the power of existence, was so powerful. Wond was a world of elemental power, and the more powerful the elemental power one controlled, the higher the position one could reach. This was not empty talk. Of course, with Brando's current strength, if he wanted to do this, he could only maintain it for 1,000th of a second. After all, theory and reality were not always the same. Brando clenched his fist as if he was feeling his own strength. He vaguely understood the reason why his strength jumped from the middle level of the elemental enlightenment to the peak of the elemental enlightenment. In fact, after seeing White's stunning sickle, he faintly felt that he had touched the threshold of something that even he could not understand in his previous life. It was the deepest mystery of this world, and White's supreme power contained the aura of the power of existence, which answered all the questions in his heart. In this world, there were very few existential powers, but chaos was definitely one of them. Brando could not help but feel lucky because in Wond, the powerful elemental power did not come without a price. This was because the more powerful the elemental power, the more difficult it was for mortals to grasp and understand the truth and secrets behind it. For example, an elemental power of the level of time and space was extremely complicated. Mortals might not be able to understand its true meaning in their lifetime, let alone master it. Those who had the highest level of elemental power might not be able to truly awaken their elemental power in the end, And those who could awaken their elemental power might not be able to understand the true meaning of elemental power in the end. Those who had lower-level elemental power would have a great advantage in this aspect. For example, someone as talented as Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles had to rely on coincidence to awaken the extreme planes. What he had mastered was just a gray elemental power. Although it was a fantasy elemental power, its level was not high. It had to be said that Brando himself was extremely lucky. Awakening his elemental power and reaching the peak of elemental power of truth all relied on extremely coincidental circumstances. He had some confidence in awakening his elemental power, but he really had no confidence in entering the extreme planes with time and space elemental power. After all, it was very likely to be the existence of existential power. But he did not expect Haku to personally demonstrate in front of him the form of existential power in Wound. Of course, if he had died under that scythe, then the series of results that followed would naturally not have existed. But he had escaped, so everything that he saw at that time had now blossomed. Looking past the elemental power, Brando was not satisfied. He faintly felt that the changes in his body did not stop there. The first thing he needed to find was the blood of the dark god. Haku was so obsessed with that thing, which meant that it was not as simple as it appeared to be. Moreover, although he understood the form of existence of time and space elemental power, the accumulation of his own absolute power had to follow a step-by-step process. It was absolutely impossible to gain power out of thin air. And this part of the increase in power, Brando suspected that it came from the blood of the dark god. His gaze quickly focused and he found that he had found the root of the problem. Although he didn't find any traces of the dark god's blood in his attribute panel, he found another thing. He found that his elite template had been directly upgraded to a leader template. Moreover, it was the highest level world leader template. This template directly increased his attributes by 150%. With these attributes, he had steadily entered the peak of the elemental enlightenment in terms of absolute attributes. Brando suddenly understood the problem with the level of his absolute power that was marked on his character status before. If it was only an increase in his understanding of the elemental power, then it would only increase the strength of his control over the elemental power itself. And the increase in absolute power was obviously dependent on the increase in his attributes. But the elite template would not be upgraded for no reason, and the most likely thing right now was that suspicious blood of the dark god. For some reason, when Brando thought of this, the scene that he saw in the dream suddenly appeared in his mind. In the third world, those people he saw should be the first generation of tree herders, the druids of the Ring of the World. They were creating gods. With the power of the blood of the dark god, Brando could not help but subconsciously touch the wound on his chest. Although it had completely healed, leaving only a shallow scar, he seemed to be able to feel the power of the blood pulsing in it. Chapter 1021. The three worlds in the dream should be arranged according to the order of time. The room he was in the first dream was probably Babel Fortress. The words recorded on the ancient parchment of the Mithril Society describe the fortress as follows. It is located in the center of the four directions of heaven and earth. Clouds float above the golden clouds. On the clouds are palaces carved out of gold and jade. Silver people in long robes walk on it. Bells ring in the clouds, hymns linger. Everything matched the scene he saw in the dream perfectly. The 11 tall and handsome humans should be the divine people, but they could also be one of the golden race. Even though Babel Fortress was the city of silver, there were still golden races. Even though in this era the only golden race left was the dragon race, but in the tens of thousands of years before Babel Fortress was destroyed, there were many golden races on the land. Most of them were buried under the dust of history, just like the ancestors buried in Valhalla. However, Brando still thought that the possibility of them being the divine people was higher. The divine people had black hair and golden eyes, which matched the description of them in the legends. Even though golden eyes were the most famous external feature of the golden race, black-haired golden race were very rare. As for the Mithril people, their eyes were somewhere between amber and agate, like a golden red flame, not a pure color. Moreover, according to what he saw in the later scenes, the Mithril people and the divine people seemed to have a deep relationship. As for the Truth Society mentioned by the tall and handsome humans, it wasn't the first time Brando had heard of it. Ovina had once mentioned that his authority was inheritance in Truth Society, but she didn't say which power this authority came from. Later, when he occasionally talked with Dark Ko Hua, the eldest daughter of Ekis inadvertently revealed some information about the Truth Society. Before the Silver Age, when Babel Fortress was destroyed, and even further back, dating back to the First and Second War with the Twilight Dragon, that was the era when the Divine People still walked the land. It was a glorious era. The Divine People and Martha created Wond and the gods together and ruled this world. Just like the gods in the pantheon, the Divine People also belonged to several organizations, the most important of which were the Truth Society, the Tribunal, the World Tree Organization. He suspected that it was the predecessor of the Druids of the Ring of the World and the Ring of the Sky, the Earth Guard, and the Will of Gaia, which only existed in legends and had never been seen before. However, Brando couldn't tell from the scene at that time whether the Truth Society mentioned by the tall and handsome humans was referring to him or them. If it was the latter, then these people must be the Divine People. The second world in the dream should be the destruction of Babel Fortress. During the Sixth War, the Azure Night broke through the sky and caused the stars to fall to the ground. The gigantic dragon that stretched across the sky was undoubtedly the projection of the Twilight Dragon in this world. Although it was just a glimpse in the dream, it left a deep impression on him. The golden red eyes above the clouds were so similar to the oppressive aura he saw above Fathom Harbor that day. He was almost certain that it was the will of the Twilight that attracted him at that time. The destruction of Babel Fortress ended the era of the gods. Countless books and documents disappeared from this disaster, and the fragments of civilization were scattered on the earth. The Silver Generation trekked in the wilderness, and the civilization was almost completely shattered and destroyed. 10,000 years later, a prophet led the Myurnas to re-establish their empire in the Black Forest. Although the Azure Knight was the first generation of the Darkness Dragon, and left a very important legacy to the Myurnas, no documents mention what this legacy was. Today's mainstream historians believe that the Azure Knight should be the earliest Myurnas, and that what he left behind was probably the golden bloodline of the Myurnas. In other words, long before the establishment of the Myurnas Empire, the Myurnas had already existed on the earth and wandered in the wilderness with other silver folk to rediscover the fire of civilization. This conjecture was also in line with the development and reproduction of civilization. The establishment of an empire could not be done in a day. Just like the Silver Elves and the Bugas, the Myurnas Empire also developed and grew in obscurity for countless years, and their powerful bloodline laid a solid foundation for the prosperity of their empire. That was why the Mardos stood on the land of Wond. The third world in the dream revealed some secrets to him. These memory fragments may be divided into several different eras. Walking through the cloudy mountains should have happened before the first generation of the Myurnas fled to the Great Plains. After the destruction of Babel Fortress, civilization and order fell apart. The Myurnas and the Silver Folk fled, and countless seeds of civilization were lost in the wilderness. The noble people forgot their noble and elegant past, and were lost on the earth. They hid in the mountains and forests, and after a long time, forgot everything in the past, and moved forward in obscurity and thorns. That was the passage recorded in the Pale poem. Then civilization sprouted in obscurity. He saw countless believers worshipping the altar towering under the sun. The birth of worship and superstition, the reverence for the gods walking in the sky, was in fact reverence for order. The seeds of civilization bloomed again in superstition and mystery after thousands of years. But about this history, it was an eternal mystery in the Orthodox historiography of Wond. Some documents from before the War of the Holy Saints, when describing this history, all mention the same word, prophet. The Myurnas appeared on the earth, and a prophet led them across the Great Plains. In the wilderness of today's four-leaf clover, they established the first civilized empire after the gods left Wond. This was the Myurnas Empire, and this was the beginning of the era of mortals. In the Silver Elves, the Bugas, and even other races that existed at that time, there was no doubt that there were similar descriptions. In the legend of the Bugas, a planeswalker, Brando thought it should be a planeswalker, because the description was very similar to the legendary Matatanians, who had the ability to travel to different worlds, was teaching mortal magic in today's Silverflash Bay. It was different from the ancient string magic used by the dragons, the predecessor of modern magic. In the story of the Silver Elves, there was the legend of the prophet Haladil. This legend was even passed down to this day. Some legends described Haladil as an elegant stag as large as a mountain. So today, in the south of Cruz and Erewhon, people still thought that the white stag was a symbol of guidance, and that it could lead lost hunters out of the forest. These legends clearly pointed to a possibility that someone had artificially spread civilization in that era, and these people were likely to be the Druids of the Ring of the World, because Brando saw in the last few fragments of the images that they used the blood of gods to create monsters and the Myrnas. The Myrnas were the last golden folk of the previous era. Unlike the dragons and several other golden folk, the Myrnas' individual strength was far inferior to their predecessors. As golden folk, they had only two most obvious characteristics, which were the golden blood and the color of their eyes. The second was that after the body was perfected, they would directly enter the realm of golden folk. However, the Myrnas' infant strength was extremely weak, and the average strength of the population was far inferior to the other golden folk. They also had a larger population, which once spread throughout the territory ruled by the Mardos Empire and formed dozens of legions. Such a population was beyond the reach of most golden folk. According to the records in the Pale poem, the golden folk were born from the blood and corpses of the gods, created by the gods. Then everything that followed could be explained. The Druids of the Ring of the World were once the most important guardians of the world's order. They monitored the spread of the Black Forest on the border of the civilized world and planted the seeds of fire. According to the literature of the Mithril Society, after the destruction of Babel Fortress and during the War of the Holy Saints, there were two major splits in the history of the Druids. In particular, the latter split gave birth to the special group of tree herders. The tree herders once followed Odin and established a terrifying army of tree herders. After Odin's failure, they split up and went underground. When they reappeared in the world, they had changed into a madman organization. Unlike the All-for-One Society, which was also a cult and the sworn enemy of the four holy cathedrals, the tree herders worshipped the power of chaos, but that was only power. They were obsessed with stealing the blood of the gods in order to gain the power of the gods and control the whole world. That was why people thought they were a group of lunatics. But speaking of which, when did the tradition of tree herders creating oracles originate? The fragmented images in the dream seem to have given the answer. If the Druids had been using the blood of the gods long before the split, it could even be traced back to a time long after the destruction of Babel Fortress. Then everything made sense. The blood of the gods had been cut off after the destruction of Babel Fortress. It might have even begun to decline before that. Odin had the blood of the gods, but it was not pure. But at that time, the fact that a bloodline like his could still become the leader of the world of order was enough to show the decline of this bloodline. The gods no longer appeared in the world, just like how the gods left wound one by one. The decline of civilization forced the Druids, the guardians of order, to choose a different path, to use the blood of the gods to bring the gods back to the world. But it was easy to imagine how difficult it was. Even in the glorious era, the gods only created the golden race from the corpses of the gods. From this point of view, the Druids could be said to have succeeded. They created the Myrnas, the most distinctive golden race. But at least they did have the blood of the golden race. In a sense, the Druids of the Ring of the World represented the authority of the gods. This was what he saw in the third world in the dream. But Brando thought that it was still a bit of a fantasy for the Druids to create the golden race with their own hands. He was more inclined to another guess, that the Druids were fulfilling the unfinished business of the pioneers. That was to say, before the destruction of Babel Fortress, the remaining gods might have already set out to continue their bloodline, but this experiment was likely to be interrupted or failed due to the invasion of the Twilight Dragon. Judging from the age of the birth of the Azure Knight, he was likely to be the product of this experiment, the first generation of the Myrnas, and the most perfect Myrnas. After the destruction of Babel Fortress, the fire of civilization and countless documents once stored in the glorious city all fell apart. Some were carried out by the refugees, but most of them were lost in the thousands of years of exile of the Silver Race. Everything about the divine people's final experiment was also lost on the land. The surviving Druids of the Ring of the World might have obtained bits and pieces of information about the plan through some unknown means, and only then did they complete the plan. And the completed Myrnas were the Myrnas who built Mardos. Among these Myrnas, the blood of the Azure Knight had been passed down from generation to generation. It could be said that they were the purest inheritors of the gods until the fall of Odin, which announced the end of an era. Brando remembered the scenes he saw of the monsters created by the druids escaping into the forest. He suddenly remembered something. The hidden paragraph in the Pale poem was about the end of the Silver Race and the rise of the Iron Race. How did the Iron Race appear on the earth? He suddenly remembered this famous question, which was one of the most discussed questions in the Amber Sword. The Silver and Gold races were all from the hand of God, and now the Myrnas also had their origins, but what about the Iron Race? In the historical records, the Black Iron folk were the subjects and slaves of the Myrna people when they were born. They were the barbarians of the forests and mountains at the beginning. Later, they were influenced by the Empire and had their own civilization. This was the origin of the Iron Race recorded in history. According to this theory, the Black Iron folk should be the native species of the Dark Forest. Judging from the records on the parchment scroll, it seemed to be true. The Black Iron folk were called hybrids by the Silver folk and the Gold folk in the earliest era, because these barbarians that walked out of the forest had the same dark magic aura as the demons and the dusk species. In the eyes of the true beings of order, they should be no different from the demons. Especially when the Black Iron folk of that era did not have their own civilization, language and writing. There were also humanoid demons in the Dark Forest, and the barbarians did not look too different from them. But the biggest difference between the Iron Race and the monsters was that they were true creatures of order. They could sense the power of the elements under the law of Tiamat, ignite the fire seed, and develop the elements. This was the most basic characteristic of the people of order. Facts also proved this point. The Iron Race quickly integrated into the civilized world in the later era, and took over the torch of civilization from the Silver Race's hands, and continued to this day. But were the Iron Race really the original race? Brando's mind repeatedly replayed the scene of the Druids creating the Myrnas. Those powerful sages in robes, they created all kinds of monsters, giants surrounded by lightning, monsters with surging flames, and superhuman beings with all kinds of abilities. Hundreds and thousands of failed creations were immediately killed, and a few trembling Myrnas were abandoned in the wilderness. Some of the monsters who were lucky enough to escape wandered into the groups of civilized creatures, some caused wars, and some were worshipped as gods. These monsters, they all had a common name and they were called the oracles. It was like Scarlet, like he was in existence like himself. Brando gently shook his head, and decided to filter these complicated thoughts out of his mind, because there were too many guesses, and some were simply impossible to judge. These chaotic thoughts seemed to rush into his mind as he woke up. He could acutely feel the shadow of the blood of the Dark God behind him, which meant that this part of the memory came from the blood of the Dark God. It seemed that the so-called black orb was not as simple as it looked. Thinking of this, he raised his head and looked at Sydney. Oh! Chapter 1022. From the beginning to the end, Sydney just watched silently, neither objecting nor helping. Her brows were slightly furrowed, her mouth was closed, and her face was serious. It was as if she was not in the forest in the west of Metz, but in the solemn sanctuary of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. When Brando saw her, he could not help but think that this was indeed the statue of the Sacred Lady of the Leo Palace. He also saw the ragged golden-red robe on Sydney's body and understood that her appearance here was not smooth sailing. It was probably not a coincidence that she found him. There was no doubt that she did not stand on the side of Her Majesty the Queen's new religion. Her relationship with Vala was that of a teacher and a friend, and she was a very principled person. It was impossible for her to betray the teachings of the Golden Flame Way. "Sorry, my mind is a little messy," he explained. "It's okay," Sydney replied. "Thank you for saving me." Sydney nodded his head in reply. Brendel replied as he observed the surroundings. The forest was quiet, and the leaves were green like a carpet. Not far away there was a stream that flowed between the rocks. A deer in the forest pricked up its ears and looked in this direction vigilantly. It was a quiet and peaceful scene. It seemed that this place was still in the previous valley, but there were no traces of fighting. It seemed that in the end they fell far away. He did not know if Bai was nearby, or if even his soul had completely disappeared. Brando could not help but have a headache. It seemed that Medisha still respected her royal sister. He did not know how she would react to this result. If she resented him because of this, he could only accept it. After all, if he was given another chance, he would make the same choice. It was too dangerous for that woman to stay in the world. But he was most worried that Metisha would be depressed because of this. He could not bear to let her be hurt again. Thinking of this, he was slightly stunned, then shook his head to throw these troubles away and asked, "How long have I been unconscious?" Sydney saw the anxiety on his face and replied, "Not long after I saw you fall from the sky and rushed here. It's only been a quarter of an hour." "Only a short while?" Brando was slightly surprised. "Madam, you are." Although he recognized Sydney, he decided to pretend that he did not know him. After all, he had never seen him before. Sydney introduced herself. She was indeed the famous statue of the adoratress of the Lion Palace, one of the high-level archbishops of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. After Sydney introduced herself, she did not wait for Brando to speak and took the initiative to say, "I'm here to see you, my lord." "Looking for me?" Brando thought that it was indeed the case. Of course he still asked. Sydney glanced at him and took down a bundle from his back without saying a word. Brando then noticed that she was also carrying a bundle on her back. The bundle was long and wrapped in layers of gray cloth. Even Sydney's robe was tattered, but this bundle was well protected and did not even have much dust on it. She laid the bundle flat on a rock and opened it, revealing many large and small pieces of shiny silver metal and a pitch-black sword hilt. The hammer at the end of the sword hilt was very ingenious. It was actually carved into the shape of a silver flame. These fragments were obviously fragments of a broken sword, and a person of Sydney's status would not pay so much attention to a broken sword, so the origin of these fragments was self-evident. Sure enough, Sydney carefully sorted out these fragments one by one. After confirming that there was not a single piece left, she solemnly looked up at him. "This is the holy sword Oderfeis," she replied solemnly, as if a sacred tone could revive the sword. "So you're here for the sword spirit of Oderfeis." Brando suddenly understood and remembered that such a thing was sleeping in his body. Speaking of which, there were a lot of miscellaneous things in his body. Previously there was the soul of the Wind Empress, the inheritance of the Dark Dragon, the Thunder Core, the power of the Planeswalker, the Elite template. Of course now it had become the Leader template in the Unknown game system. Now there was the blood of the Dark God and some other messy memories. It was not appropriate to call it a garbage dump, but to call it a moving treasure trove would always give the illusion that it would be dropped at any time. In short, it was not a good feeling. After Sydney put down the fragment of Oderfeis, she did not pursue the topic further. Instead, she said, "Before leaving the imperial capital, I met Earl Latch of Wa once." Brando was stunned for a moment before he realized that the Earl was referring to Scarlet. He could not help but feel a little amused. He fought with his life and death in Erewhon and only obtained a fief the size of Tonagil's. Moreover, the title of Earl was not legitimate because Tonagil was not a Earl's fief. In fact, his title of Earl came from Radnor, but the royal faction was unwilling to let him become the owner of Radnor. If not for the fact that the leader of this diplomatic group needed a title, he did not know how long his title of Earl would have been delayed. Even now it was just a title. And Scarlet had only walked around Cruz once, and suddenly she was on equal footing with him. Oh, it was not quite right to say that they were on equal footing. Scarlet's fief was the Latch of Wa, the hometown of the mountain people. It was located in the mountains between Ludwig and Mihodafen. In terms of area, it was at least half the size of Erewhon's. Not to mention that Scarlet was a real Earl of the Empire. In terms of value, she was many times more valuable than a half-assed Earl like him. However, when he suddenly heard news about Scarlet, he was still excited. Although he knew that Scarlet had been staying in the imperial capital, he had not heard any news about her for almost a few months. He did not know if the girl who was not good with words had been wronged, if she was under house arrest by Her Majesty the Queen, how she was doing if she was troubled. There were too many questions and he did not know how to start. "Scarlet, is she well?" he asked. Her Majesty the Queen did not trouble her, because no one can force the Azure Lance, Sydney replied. "But I heard that Her Majesty intends to betroth her to Piano's son." Sydney suddenly stopped talking because she keenly felt that the surrounding temperature suddenly dropped by several degrees. The forest rustled as if it was shivering. She looked up with some surprise and saw that the falling leaves were suspended in the air around Brando's body. A burst of white frost quickly spread across the surrounding meadow, and the swaying leaves instantly turned white to the tip of the leaves, and then turned into ice dust. In the field of time and space imprisonment, the movement of molecules was completely stagnant, and the space within a few feet was instantly reduced to nothingness. Brando was shocked to find that he had lost control of his power in his rage. He quickly retracted his mind, and then realized that it was because his power had grown too quickly that caused him to lose control. Fortunately, he reacted quickly, or the rampaging law would have hurt him. Piano, the chief of the mountain people? He asked coldly. Sydney looked at him and then nodded. His son is worthy. No one is qualified to make my subordinates marry. Your Majesty the Queen only has this little vision. This should be just a statement, but if Count Latch insists on not bowing his head, Her Majesty the Queen will do so, Sydney said. Brando suddenly felt a little irritated. For some reason he could not explain. That stupid girl, what's wrong with bowing her head for a while? Can I not trust her? He did not know who he was scolding, but he complained first, and then sighed softly and calmed down again. Sydney saw his expression and was not surprised. Your Excellency the Count, Her Majesty the Queen got different from you in the final battle. Odin gave her not only power but also authority, so the Dragon Queen, the Lion people, the Myrnas, and the Senia people all agreed with her. Even Madara did not resist Her Majesty. She suddenly said, But Your Excellency the Count, you got the bloodline of the War Dragon. In this regard, you are far inferior to her. And she has more time than you. After decades of careful planning and preparation, her trump cards are far more than what you see. It will be difficult for you to only rely on the eldest son to fight against her. You all know. Brando reacted. We will know after your battle with Williams, Your Excellency. Brando could not help but smile bitterly. So that was it. He thought he had hidden it well, but he did not expect that the upper echelons of the Holy Cathedral of Fire already knew that he had the inheritance of the Darkness Dragon. He was a little curious. If that's the case, why are you indifferent? This is the same as the Farnezane's indifference. As for the reason, I'm sure you've already guessed it. That's why it's unrealistic for you to hope that the Farnezane or any other faction will interfere in this war. The Bugas may support you, but that is only a part of them. The Silver City is divided all year round, and they are also divided into many factions. Sydney quickly answered his doubts. Brando shook his head again. In fact, he had expected it. Since the conversation with Tumen, he found that this matter was not as simple as it seemed on the surface. If even the Holy Cathedral of Fire could be divided into two, how could Farnezane's Holy Church of Light be an exception? Therefore, Farnezane's Pope choosing to bide his time was also one of the possibilities. Everything that was happening before their eyes was not too far out of their expectations. Is that why you came to me, Miss Sydney? Sydney nodded his head honestly. The Silver Queen intends to restore the dynasty of the Myrnas. Saint Vara and I could not agree with her approach. She put the Saint Vara under house arrest, and I escaped from the capital alone. Her Majesty the Queen has won over the scholastics and made many people stand on the side of the Protestantism, but in the local areas, there are still many people who support the views of the Saint Vara. These people in Ludwig and Metz influence the opinions of a large number of nobles. If you only order them in the name of the eldest son of the emperor, it will not have much effect. Can't they reach a consensus in the face of a great enemy? This is a war of doctrines. Who to listen to is a very serious question. That's true. Brando realized that he had thought of the problem too simply. In fact, the Prime Minister's daughter had also raised a similar problem with him, but she was not an authority in the religious world, so the weight of her words was not on the same level. He looked at the fragment of the holy sword Oderfeis in Sydney's hand. He asked, Lady Sydney, what do you mean? The Sanctum Sanctorum asked me to find you because he wanted you to reforge this sword, and use the flaming blade as a token to clean up the Holy Sanctorum. He said that he wanted you to show another possibility in history. Sydney paused and explained. These were His Excellency Vara's original words. Brando's eyes widened in surprise. He had thought that his psychological endurance was good enough, but he did not expect that it was still not good enough in front of Saint Vara, who would not give up until she said something shocking. He understood the meaning of this sentence and could not help but ask in disbelief, Lady Sydney, do you think this is a fairy tale? You mean to ask me to lead the Holy Cathedral of Fire? Do you really understand the meaning of this sentence? This is not a joke. Even in the most bizarre bedside legends, I have never heard of such a story. There was only one meaning in Vara's words, and that was to pass on the position of the Holy See to him. However, Brando admitted that he did not have the so-called God-given leadership temperament, so that people would understand at a glance that he was a destined person, a destined king, and people would bow their heads and worship him. Most of the time he had relied on his foresight to get to where he was today. Sometimes he would go overboard and sometimes he would manage to subdue a group of witches as his subordinates. However, he had never taken it seriously. Instead, he had become increasingly uninterested in these things. From the loop of trade winds to the Battle of Ampere Seal, he had always taken one step at a time. He had paid countless blood and lives to barely change Erwin's future. But today, a big shot of the Holy Cathedral of Fire suddenly came in front of him and said that he wanted to be the Holy See. Was this not a joke? This was simply a joke. He shook his head in confusion and said earnestly, "Miss Sydney, I know that the soul of Oderfice is sleeping in my body, so you have no choice but to come and beg me. But if you urgently need my help, I am actually willing to form an alliance with you to help you reforge this holy sword, because we now have a common enemy and goal. But as for the ownership of this holy sword and the position of the Holy See, I am really not interested." Brando spread his hands and said, "Let's take 10,000 steps back. First of all, I am not a cruise person. In addition, before this, I have never understood the teachings of the Way of the Golden Flames and have no interest in the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Are you sure that an outsider like me will lead the Holy Cathedral? Not to mention you, even I don't know what direction I will lead you to." He had a preconceived notion that the Holy Cathedral of Fire had come up with such a ridiculous idea because the soul of Oderfice was in his body. As for the empty promise, everything else would be easy if he was tempted first. After all, the Holy Cathedral of Fire was such a behemoth. Could he command the world just by holding a holy sword? That was a story in fantasy novels. If the people below ignored him, not to mention the holy sword Oderfice, even if he held the amber sword, it would be useless. He did not want to be a puppet at all. If the Holy Cathedral wanted to form an alliance with him, then it would be better for everyone to take a step back and find a more sincere way. But what Brando did not expect was that Sydney's expression became serious. Although she had always been very serious, she was even more serious now. She looked at him and replied solemnly, "Your Excellency, what do you think the teachings of the Way of the Golden Flames are? Order and protection. It is not as difficult to understand as you think. His Excellency Vala chose you, and the Holy Sword Oderfice also chose you. I believe it is not too wrong." Brando was so stunned that he forgot what he was going to say. "Are you serious, Lady Sydney?" Sydney nodded, then shook her head. "I am just following the choice of the Holy Sword Oderfice. Perhaps you still don't understand the meaning of the flaming blade, but it doesn't matter. I believe you will eventually understand." Brando shook his head. "I still need to think about it. I think it is better to be more cautious about this matter. As for the recasting of the flaming blade, I will consider it." As he spoke, he stood up from the ground and looked up in the direction of the valley. He was a little worried about Senior and Medisha. He asked, "I am going to find my companions. Are you coming with me, lady?" Sydney nodded, as if she did not care about the question. She put away her bag again and stood up. Oh. Chapter 10:23. Brando estimated his location and realized that he should be in the latter half of the valley. The secret door of the Perkin Sanctum was at the entrance of the valley, which was at least 2 to 3 miles away from here. He did not know where the battle took place in the valley, but it should not be too far away. He used the communication crystal to contact Chun Yushan, but there was no reply. He felt a little uneasy, so he contacted Medisha. This time the call went through. Brando heaved a sigh of relief. He listened to the static on the other side of the crystal, and then Medisha told him in a weak voice, "She is fine. Andrique and her brother are also here. Hippamera is still unconscious, but something happened to Madame Maynard." Brando's heart skipped a beat, and he asked what the problem was. Medisha panted slightly and said, "I'm not sure what happened, but it seems like Madame Maynard is wrapped in a cocoon." Cocoon? Brando was stunned. He heard Medisha trying to suppress the pain in her voice, and he knew that she was seriously injured. He quickly comforted the silver elf princess and asked her not to move, and said that he would be there soon. Medisha was as docile and obedient as usual. She listened to him and handed the communication crystal in her hand to Andrique. Brando then asked where they were, but the vampire princess was as impatient as usual. She told him that she saw him fall in the southwest direction, and that it should not be far away. Brando heard this and looked up at the valley. He realized that the place where he fought with Bai was in the middle of the valley. This meant that the holy cellar that was used to seal the entire valley, and there was an entrance at each end. Bai and the others entered from the other end. Brando asked Andrique to take care of the wounded, and asked a few more questions about Bai. In the end he got the answer that Bai fell with him. He was slightly stunned and realized that the woman might have really died. He could not help but worry about Medisha's current situation. He put away the communication crystal, knowing that worrying was useless. The most important thing now was to meet up with Medisha and the others. He thought for a moment and decided to move along the stream. The terrain here was gradually lower, and the valley extended downward. After passing through the lush greenery, the stream would inevitably flow to the middle of the valley, so he did not have to worry about going the wrong way. He trod on the rocks beside the stream, and Archbishop Sidney followed at a distance of 10 meters or so without saying a word. Brando looked back at the woman and suddenly felt a little awkward. After all, she was one of the real high-ranking members of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. She had always been above everyone else, and he did not dare to treat her as a follower. He thought for a moment and decided to find a topic to talk about, so he stopped and asked, "Miss Sidney, take this opportunity to tell me about Orderfis. Although I have heard of the name of this sword in Erewhon, that's all." Sidney nodded and moved closer to him. She thought for a moment and said, "Everyone knows that Orderfis is the sword of the Flame King. 1,000 years ago, the various races that were oppressed by the Myurnas fled from the Mardos Empire from Gonciato, and went into exile on the Great Plains. They saw a meteor fall from the sky in the wilderness. At the place where the meteor fell, a golden sacred sword was burning in the fire. That is the sacred sword Orderfis. This is the most popular legend about the flame blade." Brando nodded. He had also heard of this legend in the Amber Sword. It was basically a bedtime story that everyone in Cruz knew, and it was also widely spread in Erewhon. However, he had also heard different versions of the story from Bosley, the master craftsman of Abes, and Saint Tossel himself. The latter two versions were much more reliable than this widespread folk legend, but this time he did not really intend to discuss the story behind it with Sidney, so he was a good listener and did not take the initiative to speak. But in fact, Orderfis is a scepter. This scepter is divided into 3 parts, and the flame blade is just one of them. Divided into 3 parts? There is also a saying that it is divided into 4 parts. This saying is not completely correct because the flame orb and the flame blade are one. The flame blade is forged with the power of the flame orb. Without the power of the flame orb, the flame blade is incomplete. Brando suddenly interrupted this sentence. "Wait, what did you say?" "I said that without the power of the flame orb, the flame blade is incomplete, just like what you see now, Your Excellency." "No, I meant the previous sentence." Sidney was stunned. "The flame blade is forged with the power of the flame orb." "No, even more than that. The flame orb and the flame blade are one." "You mean the flame orb?" "Yes." Sidney looked at him and nodded solemnly. "The power that is nurtured in the flame orb is the sword spirit of Orderfis." Brando's expression was a little interesting. He asked, "I heard that there are orbs of darkness and orbs of ice in this world. Is there any connection between them and the flame orb?" Sidney's platinum eyes flashed with a hint of doubt. She probably did not expect Brando to ask this question. She thought for a moment and nodded seriously. "There is indeed such a legend. I heard that Your Excellency's sword is the Haurangaya in the Sacred Stone Hall. Is that true?" "There is such a thing, but I lost the sword earlier. I have to go and get it back later." Brando replied that there was a rumor about the sword. It said that the Golden Mane Lionmane Beastmen launched an attack on the human world in advance to ask for the sword in his hand back. This rumor once made him extremely uneasy, thinking that he had shaken the world in advance. Of course, now it was proven that the interests involved in the Holy War of the Earth Temple were far more complicated than the bizarre rumors in the countryside. But compared to that, Brando felt that the first ending was better. The Haurangaya in your excellency's hand should be after it was damaged, right? Sydney asked. Brando nodded again. Then again, if he had the original Haurangaya in his hand, his life would be even more difficult than now. It was a sacred object that was not inferior to the azure lance. It was even a level higher than the mountains and rivers. After all, it was a sacred object that symbolized the earth, just like how the flame blade Orderfis was the ultimate artifact of the fire element treasure, symbolizing the supreme order of the fire element world. Wait a minute. Brando vaguely felt that he seemed to have grasped something. Sydney looked at his expression and knew that he had guessed it, so he replied, "The situation of Haurangaya is somewhat similar to that of Orderfis. It had been divided into 3 before it was lost. The Haurangaya was taken away by a dwarf clan, and the power of the orb of the earth was sleeping in the part of the scepter. Because the scepter was taken away by Ko Hua in the Twilight battle, this sacred object is equivalent to being useless. The situation of Orderfis is the opposite. The power of the orb of the flame is in the part of the sword, and the scepter part has long been lost. The orb of the ice was used by sabers to forge the frost chant Sinna, but this sacred sword was also damaged in the War of the Holy Saints. Holy crap, Brando thought to himself. Could it be that he was really the legendary king of junk? Not to mention Orderfis and the Haurangaya, even the frost chant Sinna seemed to be in his hands. Not only that, but they were all King broken. The king of junk, Brando felt that if he was still in the Amber Sword, he would definitely be crowned with this title by the system. It was well known that the system had no integrity at all when it rewarded players with titles back then. Rogo, the Ratbane, was obtained by a player who killed a few more rats while farming plague rats to level up. The key point was that there were several upgraded versions of this title. Doom of the Rats, Destroyer of the Sewers. It was simply too painful to listen to. Brando hurriedly opened his character menu and glanced at it, fearing that a title such as King of Junk, Lord of Scavengers would suddenly appear. Fortunately, this inexplicable system did not seem to intend to play a joke on him. While he breathed a sigh of relief, he cautiously decided not to mention it. Orderfis and Haurangaya had already been exposed, but with the addition of the Mountain's Kin and the Frost Chant Sinna, it was a little too big of a target. It made him feel like he was a moving treasure trove. Sydney did not notice his mental activity and continued. The Orb of Light is sleeping in the divine power of Aramisal. As for the Orb of Darkness, it appeared in Cruz hundreds of years ago, but then disappeared. No one has ever seen the Orb of Wind, and legend has it that there is a natural orb, which is said to be sleeping under the Ring of the World, but has never appeared in the world. These 7 orbs are in fact the cornerstones of the 7 elemental order, symbolizing the supreme power of the elements in a world. Most of them are tokens of the various elemental gods, such as Haurangaya and Orderfis. I see. Brando suddenly realized that the Orb of Light was in the divine power of Aramisal. He had a hunch in his heart that among the 4 artifacts that the Flame King and the others took out from the 4 Holy Valley of the 4 Sages, the other 2 should be more or less related to the other 2 elemental orbs. Since the sacred artifacts of fire and earth were scepters, perhaps the sacred mark of azure and the sacred mark of wind were also part of the scepter of nature and the scepter of wind. He then asked about the details of the other 3 sacred artifacts that were taken out from the Valley of the 4 Sages. This part of the history was actually related to the history of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. When talking about the history of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, Sydney's serious face lit up. Although her expression was still serious, her narration became much smoother. She said that the people who left the Mardos Empire were not actually resisting oppression or escaping tyranny, but were criminals who were exiled by the Myurnas. She also cited the description of the Mardos Empire by the scholastic master Rentgen Dever in the Millennium Chronicle in 1666 as an example to prove that the laws of the Mardos Empire were harsh. At that time there were many kinds of banishment, and often the whole family was implicated and exiled to the glaciers or plains. The Flame King was the 2nd generation born among the refugees. When he came of age, he happened to experience the incident described in the history books where he saw a meteor fall in the wilderness. Sydney said that the incident of seeing a meteor fall in the wilderness was recorded in many historical documents. She gave the most authoritative example, the astronomical record of the Empire's astrologers recorded in the year of the Dragon's Fear. The record described that the night was as bright as day, and there were stars in a ring, falling from the west to the east through the Lyra galaxy. The Lyra galaxy was in the east of today's wilderness of the Four Territories, and it was said that this astronomical record matched the descriptions of some later records of people who had experienced it. Sydney was, after all, an archbishop. She could recite the history of the church like the back of her hand. There was no need for her to think about it. It was as if she had experienced it herself. The vast sea of scriptures was stored in her heart, and she could use them at will. As she talked to Brando about the history of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, the gap between the two was finally reduced. They were no longer as silent as before, but Brando always felt that he had a teacher who spoke and acted like the holy statues in the Holy Cathedral. As Sydney narrated the history of the Holy Cathedral, she would occasionally insert the reasons and doctrines for the establishment of the Holy Cathedral. The reasons were self-evident, but Brando was not interested in these at all. He was thinking about the previous conversation. If the power in the Black Pearl was actually the blood of the God of Darkness, then could the power sleeping in the other pearls also be the blood of the God of Darkness? If so, then where did this pure blood of the elemental god come from, and for what purpose was it created? Was it from the hands of the cultists, or was it the legacy of the gods? Once this thought was born, it could not be stopped and spread endlessly in Brando's mind. Of these four sacred objects, Odorfice was obtained by the late King Gretel, the azure sky was obtained by Alanta, the sacred wind empress was obtained by Delu Saint Tossel, and the Alamizer was obtained by Alberta Fanson. Of the four, the first two were the leaders of the refugees. The late King Gretel was a human, and Alanta had half the blood of the Silver Elves. The last two were of noble birth and was the daughter of a noble of the Mist Elves, and the other was also the son of a noble of the Aenir. When Sydney finally talked about the four sages obtaining the four sacred objects from the Four Holy Valley, Brando finally saw Medisha resting in the forest in front of him. "My lord." Medisha also noticed them at the first moment. Brando turned back and looked at Sydney apologetically. This archbishop had a good temper. Although he always had a straight face, he did not mind and nodded at him. Brando hurried to Medisha's side. The Silver Elf princess was somewhat agitated and tried to stand up, but because of her severe injuries, she gave up. Brando pressed the little girl's shoulder and took out a bottle of holy water to feed her. At this time, Andrique and Mephistopheles came out from behind the forest. The female vampire was also badly injured, but vampires were born with strong recovery abilities. At this time, other than the tattered armor, there were no visible wounds on her body, but her originally pale face was now as white as a sheet of paper. As Brando had already introduced Sydney and what happened over there through the messaging crystal, he was not completely a stranger at this time. Brando introduced his subordinates one by one to the archbishop. When he introduced the two vampire siblings, he hesitated for a moment, but still said it bluntly. Sydney had already known that this was a pair of vampire sisters, but he did not say much. He only gave them an extra glance. "Where is Miss Maynold?" Brando asked again. "In the back." Mephistopheles replied weakly. The cute boy saw Brando and smiled a little embarrassedly. Because he was injured, he had to drink his master's blood to recover. Brendel nodded at him, not minding his actions at all. In fact, he was quite touched when he rushed over to the holy cellar without a care for his own safety. "I want one too." Andrique also asked. "Why, you are not injured?" Brando asked in a bad mood. Did she really think that he was dessert after a meal? In the end, Andrique took out a dagger from nowhere and cut a cut about 0.5 millimeter wide on her finger. Then she looked up at him with blood-red eyes. Chapter 1024. Brando finally managed to trick Andrique into letting him go for the time being. Then, under the guidance of Medisha, he saw the cocoon that imprisoned Amelia. The giant cocoon of light was suspended between two ancient white oak trees. It was about 11 to 12 feet tall, and it was so wide that it would take two people to wrap their arms around it. It was about half a person's height from the ground, and it was shaped like a spindle. Inside the cocoon there was a vague outline of a woman. It was the female knight, Maynold. Brando looked up at the cocoon of light. He walked over and touched its surface with his hand. The soft light penetrated his palm, and the temperature from the surface was similar to that of a human body. Although the cocoon of light was very soft, it was also very tough. It was obviously not that easy to destroy. Medisha, who was slightly weak, explained everything that had happened. Andrique and Mephistopheles had walked through the same secret passage as Allium Japonicum, but they were a little late. When they came to the surface, they only saw the cocoon of light and the unconscious Hippamera. Andrique found this thing nearby. Medisha said as she took out a slate. It was the war slate that Brando had seen under the tomb. However, the slate had lost its metallic luster and had become gray. Many of the patterns on its surface had also disappeared. This was obviously the appearance of the inheritance in the war slate after it was activated. Brando understood what had happened when he saw the slate. He breathed a sigh of relief. Looking at the cocoon of light, he replied, "It seems that Lady Maynard accidentally activated this slate and obtained the inheritance on it. This cocoon of light should be the war slate's self-protection mechanism. Then there should be no problem." "No problem?" Medisha asked uncertainly. Compared to Brando, she had never understood these things. "No problem," Brando said with certainty. "But she should be in this state for a while. Medisha, you stay behind to take care of Madame Maynard. I'll arrange for Andrique and the rest to stay with you. There shouldn't be any strong enemies around here. You guys should be able to protect each other." Medisha was slightly startled. She was keenly aware of the hidden meaning in this sentence. She raised her head and asked, "My lord, are you leaving?" Only then did Brando remember that he had called Medisha over midway. She didn't know about Yura's situation yet, so he explained it to her in detail. Medisha frowned as she listened. Obviously, the sudden appearance of the undead was beyond her expectations. She thought carefully before replying, "Although Miss Delphian and I thought that Her Majesty had another trump card, we didn't expect it to be the undead. Fortunately, Yura and my lord discovered their arrangement in advance. Otherwise, we might have been caught off guard. We have to react quickly." "So, you stay and inform the county to be on guard at the port," Brando said. "But you don't have to worry too much. Things haven't reached the stage you think they will. According to your sister, the White Legion should want to use the rule fragments to change the order of the area around Fat-Tan and turn it into a state of eternal night. In a state without sunlight and with the double blessing of the land of the dead, the undead will be unprecedentedly strong. On the other hand, the humans will fall into a state of chaos due to the sudden solar eclipse. Their plan is good, but the key to this plan is that the rule fragments of Fat-Tan Port are currently in our hands. How can I let them do as they wish?" Medisha suddenly raised her eyebrows and said, "My lord, I have an idea." In fact, before this, Miss Delphian and I plan to strike first to gain the upper hand. Instead of waiting for the Silver Queen to arrange her troops, it's better to disrupt their plan first. From a strategic point of view, attacking is more active than defending. Now that the initiative is in our hands, why don't we take this opportunity to do more things?" Brando was interested. He was not good at war. He could command a battle, but when it came to the strategic level, he was a little stretched. Fortunately, he had Medisha by his side. The little silver elf princess had personally participated in and commanded the War of the Holy Saints. It was more than enough to deal with the current situation. It was simply a waste of talent. After all, she was the most famous general 1,000 years ago. At that time, the continent was filled with the flames of war. Medisha smiled mysteriously. "My lord, you plan to seize part of the authority of the undead artifact, right?" Brando nodded. According to Yura's description, the commander of the undead army should have a part of the authority of the undead artifact. That was why he could control thousands of skeletons to march in the wilderness. These thousands of skeletons were not worth mentioning in his eyes, but he was very interested in the undead artifact. Even if it was only a part of the authority, he might be able to get something out of it. That was why he agreed to Yura's plan as soon as he heard about it. "We can make the White Legions act real and then beat them at their own game. If we're lucky, we might be able to solve the current predicament at Fathom Harbor," Medisha replied. Brando understood the little silver elf princess's plan. He raised his eyebrows slightly and thought about the feasibility of this plan. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that the chances were higher. He could not help but feel a little excited. He took a deep breath and said in a low voice, "If that's the case, we have to be careful of the leak of information first. Cruz's people are unlikely to let your sister and the others act alone. They might have a small garrison nearby. I have to go and deal with these people. Medisha nodded and asked, My lord, will you be fine by yourself? Do you need me to go too? Or do you want to call Mr. the Shire? Brando shook his head. The Shire will leave him at the harbor. You and Hipamra have both come out. I have to leave someone at the harbor in case of an emergency. As for you, stay here and recuperate. This is the Lord's order. But I've already used the holy water. My wounds have already healed. I'm just a little weak at most. Although I can't fight, I can still use my planeswalker's authority, Medisha argued weakly. Speaking of injuries, Brando could not help but look at her chest. The originally shocking wound had indeed gradually healed under the powerful effects of the holy water. Now, under the tattered armor, there were large patches of snow-white skin and seductive curves that had just begun to develop. Brando coughed and was immediately embarrassed. Medisha finally noticed that her lord's expression was a little strange. She looked down and immediately blushed. She bit her lips and hurriedly covered her exposed body with her hands. If it were anyone else in this situation, they would inevitably be angry. However, Medisha, with her usual temperament, could not say anything. The atmosphere between the two was a little awkward. After a while, Brando muttered, Don't worry, my little princess. I've already made arrangements. I won't joke about Yura's safety. You should understand. Medisha grunted in response. But after a while she was still worried and whispered, Why don't we bring Andrique along? She can still fight. Brando still shook his head. No need. You and Mephistopheles can't fight. Hipamra is also unconscious. Only Andrique can fight. I'll only be at ease if she stays here. After that, he raised his head and looked in the direction of the other entrance of the valley. Madara's skeleton should have come from that direction. Cruz's people shouldn't be too far away. Medisha also looked at the other entrance of the valley. The verdant valley reflected the intoxicating green under the sunlight. She suddenly said, Maybe there's someone who can help you, my lord. Who? Brando turned his head. That skeleton. Don't tell me you've forgotten about it, my lord. Krot. It's still alive? Brando finally remembered the poor creature and asked in surprise. Yes, and Sir John Lorry's also wants to see you. Brando was stunned and then nodded. The two fell into silence for a while. It seemed that they both knew that there was a problem that they had not yet asked, but they were both worried about each other's feelings and did not want to take the initiative to speak. After a while, Brando said faintly, Medisha, your sister. I already know. Medisha shook her head hard. Say no more, my lord. Brando looked at the silver elf girl. Medisha lowered her head and did not say a word. It made him feel a little uneasy. Is it really nothing? Medisha was silent for a while. Then she said, After the silver elves die, they go to a place called Alfheim. It is a sacred and peaceful valley, the Holy Silver Valley. It is the spiritual home of the silver elves. One day I will see my sister, father, and mother there. They just reached that beautiful paradise before me. Although it sounds beautiful, I hope that Medisha can stay by my side forever and live in this world. My lord, you really don't know how to comfort people. Medisha almost laughed. Besides, my lord will also grow old. One day I will leave my lord. That's fine. When the time comes, I will accompany you to that Alfheim. That won't do. That is the holy land of the silver elves. My lord, you are a human. You can't enter. That's not necessarily true. I am a planeswalker. Can't I travel through planes? You are too stubborn, my lord. This was the second time that Brando saw the undead of the Templar Knight. It lowered its head and sat under a towering white rock. It seemed to be in deep thought. The end of its long cloak dragged to the ground. It was a poignant red, as if it was the end of a hero. A rusty sword was inserted in front of it. A beam of golden sunlight shone down from the treetops and shone on the hilt. The gems on the hilt shone brightly, as if they were telling a story from before time had passed. Sir John Lorry's sat behind the sword. Its injuries seemed to have almost recovered, at least on the surface. However, the golden flames in its eye sockets were much dimmer. You are here, young knight. Sensing Brando's arrival, Lorry's raised its head. On its deeply sunken skull, the golden crown shone brightly. I am not a knight. Brando showed the Halran Gaia that he had found with great difficulty. I am a warrior, a swordsman, but not a knight. It's all the same. With the passing of life, time has a different meaning in my eyes. The knowledge of the past no longer binds some eternal meaning. The undead replied, in my eyes, a knight is not an identity, but a symbol of nobility. It symbolizes a person who has a certain pursuit. I can see your persistence. Why deny it? I don't think it will embarrass you. Brando was silent. Where is your wife, respected knight? He looked around but did not see the soul of Lorison's lover, nor did he see the shadow of the defeated knight Krot. She left. The mortal world is only a restraint to her, even my love is the same. But she finally found peace and relief. This is all thanks to you. The voice of the undead was as calm as a dream. Brando smiled. You don't have to thank me. I didn't do it without purpose. Besides, the result is not bad. Your protection finally has meaning. I am also leaving, the undead replied. I can feel a voice calling me. My soul is about to return to eternity. This world presents a variety of meanings in front of my eyes at this moment, and I can't help but recall my own era. In that era, Cruz Valley was evergreen and the green fields were like a dream. We could pursue our beliefs and dreams to our heart's content. Brando quietly listened to Lorison talk about his past, like an old man who was about to die, slowly telling the story behind the dust of time. The young knight, the shining faith, the setbacks and resistance, and even the lifelong protection. What supported such a faith in silence was a shining will. The undead quietly finished the story, then raised its head and looked at Brando with its eyes that pulsed with golden soul flames. I am about to leave, but before I leave I will give you a gift, the undead said slowly. Please come to my side, young knight. Brando was slightly stunned and looked at Lorison in surprise. The undead met his gaze calmly and did not reveal any malice. Brando hesitated for a moment, but still walked in front of Lorison. The undead suddenly stood up and stretched out its bony hand to pull out the sword from the ground, but it did not make any move to attack. Brando was stunned for a moment and then relaxed. The undead raised the sword high and then gently put the tip of the sword on Brando's shoulder. Do you know the meaning and weight of glory, young knight? It will be by your side for life, the undead replied in a loud voice. I don't have anything else, only some of the insights I had when I was alive. These memories of the past have long lost their meaning to me, but I hope they can be of help to you. With these words, Brando suddenly felt that the scenery around him dissipated like sand in the wind, and a solemn holy sound came from all directions. He looked up and found that Lorison's undead was nowhere to be seen. He was alone in the center of a temple, kneeling on one knee. There were huge floor-to-ceiling rose-colored windows on all sides, and a pure white beam of light shone down through the gaps in the empty vault above his head and fell on the ground beside him, forming a huge spot of light in the darkness. It was impossible to see clearly in the darkness. It was as if there were rows of long benches in a church, and it was unknown if there were people sitting on them. Waves of whispers came from all directions and gathered together, buzzing as if they were discussing, or as if they were watching from the sidelines. Brendel suddenly understood that this was a scene that the knight's soul had experienced before, and it was probably one of the few scenes that left the deepest impression in his life. But as time passed, the originally clear memories became blurry. The audience in the holy cathedral was like a photo that had been washed away by water. It had faded to the point that there was almost no trace left behind. But everything that happened in the center of the holy cathedral was forever engraved in his memory. This was the inheritance, the knight's beliefs and ideals. Lorison intended to give his most important things to him. He had received all of this on the same occasion, and today he was returning the power that belonged to the knight in the same way. In the Amber Sword, this was also a rare opportunity that could not be forced. The skills that these heroes had mastered were far from those that could be found anywhere. The key was that after incorporating personal understanding and perception, most of these skills were unique. Brando never dreamed that he would accidentally trigger a hidden quest. He did not know if he was becoming less and less sensitive to things in the game, or if he had been too assimilated by the world. If this quest line had been in the past, he would have noticed it long ago. The moment Lorison's undead appeared, he probably should have noticed it, but he did not. Until now, everything was as if it had happened naturally. He saw a ball of bright white light appear in front of him. He could not see the face of the figure in the white light. It was as if there were many faces overlapping. Some of them were familiar to him, some of them he had even seen before. However, there were also some that he was unfamiliar with and had never seen before. These familiar and unfamiliar faces overlapped with each other. They opened their mouths together and recited something in a common voice. When Brando heard this voice, he seemed to have heard it clearly, but it also seemed to be a buzzing noise in his ears until pieces of memory flowed into his mind. The glorious knight stood on the hill. Banners like a forest, cheers like a tide. The sword held high shone with a cold light. Brando seemed to see himself in it, and also saw Lorison's life. Then he naturally understood the origin of this skill. The layers of illusions in front of him suddenly disappeared, and the emerald forest returned to his vision. He was still standing under the huge white rock, and the forest was still green like a dream. Lorison's sword was still quietly inserted in front of him, but the undead of the night was long gone. Only the afternoon sun shone warmly in the forest, embellishing the meadow with spots of light. A long cloak lay on the meadow, carrying the breath of its owner when he was alive. It was as dazzling as blood, and only a monotonous voice echoed in Brando's mind. Receive the secret skill of the Templar Knight, divine baptism. He pondered for a long time before silently picking up the cloak on the ground, and then gently covering Lorison's sword with it. Then he pulled out Halran Gaia and carved a line of flying words on the rock with the tip of the sword. This is the tomb of a knight. His life protected love and faith. His loyalty and ideals may not be known to the world, but the valley is evergreen, and his faith is everlasting. Oh,